In a town forgotten by time, where trouble rides in with the wind and legends fade slower than scars, Sorrel Keating stepped down from the stage and learned it before her boots even found steady ground, what it meant to be weighed and dismissed by a stranger's eyes. Dust rose around her like a curtain that refused to fall. The platform boards of Ash Mesa creaked under the bustle of a late summer arrival. Tired men slapping reins, children craning for soldiers or sweets, women gathering parcels to their chests. The sun made long, pale knives of every shadow. Sorrel stood beside her trunk, breath shallow, left hand braced on the carved hickory cane she had polished to a shine back in Mason County. She'd promised herself she would not lean on it until she reached her room. His room, their room, she corrected, feeling heat rise into her cheeks, because no first impression should be a limp. Not to a man who had written such careful letters, not to a future that might still be kind. Miss Keating. His voice came from the far end of the platform. Cyrus Brand wore his success like a tailored duster, precise, crisp, not a thread out of place. Silver buckle, clean boots, hatband stitched with someone else's initials. The cattleman's mouth made a line that looked permanent. Beside him, Vince Mallory lounged against a post and smiled without warmth. "I'm Sorrel," she said, letting the name be steady, the way she practiced in a mirror. "You are not your Limp. You are not your Limp." "Mr. Brand, it's good to walk," he said, and his eyes flicked down and back so fast it might have been a blink. "Come along. Let's see your pace." The cane bit the plank with a sound Sorrel felt more than heard. She took a measured step, then another. The platform boards ran lengthwise. The grain tugged at her boot like a current. The heat under her skirts climbed. There were kinder ways to ask, she thought. There were kinder worlds than this one. Vince Mallory's chuckle scratched at the quiet. "You didn't ask in the letters for a woman who creaks like a porch." Cyrus did not look at Vince. He did not look at Sorrel either. "My requirements were plain. They had been orderly script detailing a home north of town, a need for a God-fearing wife to keep books, a woman who could handle distance and dust." Sorrel had held each note like a fragile thing and studied it until dawn. She had written back, with careful honesty, that she read numbers like water, that she kept lists in a small lined book, that she had known hunger and could make soup from a bone and a prayer, that her left leg would always lag a half beat behind, a memory from a childhood fever. She had assumed. She had hoped. "You said you needed a partner," Sorrel managed. "You said," Cyrus lifted a hand. The gesture sliced her sentence cleanly in two. "I said I needed a wife who could stand the work. I will not buy a plow with a cracked handle." The platform stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sorrel swallowed without letting it choke her. The cane's polish was a dark mirror. In it she saw a small, compact figure in a dove-gray dress she had stitched herself on long, poor evenings. She saw brown hair twisted into a coil. She saw a woman who had crossed two territories by stagecoach because hope had the last word over fear. "I am not a plow." Cyrus's mouth twitched, disbelief or disapproval. "It did not matter. You'll be reimbursed the fare back to Mason County." "I sold the house," she said calmly, though her heart gave a sudden, humiliating leap at the word house. It had been a room above a grocer's shop, and it had been hers, and everything in it that could be sold. That was when he finally looked at her. Truly looked, as if a thought had to climb a ladder to reach his eyes. "Then you've miscalculated." Sorrel's fingers tightened around the cane. She could feel, through wood and bone, the way her heart wanted to gallop, wanted to sprint the way she never could. She did not let it. The habit of years steadied her. Inhale on a count, exhale on another, take the next step. She had been called weak by people who could not carry the weight of their own cruelty. She had learned to inventory pain the way one inventories flour by the cup, by the handful, so it could be budgeted, not wasted. "You answered my letters," she said. "You liked what I wrote." I liked your penmanship, Vince Mallory added with a grin that wanted to bruise. But I reckon Bran's right. We're a ranch, not a charity. Sorrel's next breath tasted like iron. She could leave the platform. She could drag her trunk to the station master's bench and sit until the light went out of the world. And then she could sit some more. She could shrink. She had shrunk before. The memory of doing so was its own kind of limp. Sir. A voice said from down the platform, quiet and even, a wrench laid on velvet. I'll ask you to step back. The blacksmith had the shoulders of a man who carried iron in both hands, and the eyes of a man who had carried grief and found a way to keep walking. He wore a leather apron darkened by the honest work of years. A hammer hung at his side like a friend. Sorrel had not seen him approach, but she felt, with a kind of relief that hurt, that he had always been there. Not waiting for her, not a storybook, just existing in a way that made the air feel less sharp. Cyrus Brand turned with the disdain of a man who believed the world was a long table and that he always sat at its head. This is my affair, Cole. Thatcher Cole rested 2 fingers lightly on Sorrel's trunk, as if testing its weight. You made it everyone's when you called a woman a tool in front of half the town. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet traveled farther than shouting would have. Miss Keating, you look thirsty. There's a pump at the end of the street. I'll take the trunk. His gaze slid back to Cyrus, and it was like watching a door close softly. Unless a man with 2 good legs needs help moving his own mouth from trouble. Vince's hand twitched near his belt. Not near a gun Ash Mesa was new to shooting in daylight, but near a knife a boy might carry to prove something to himself. Cyrus's face flushed a slow, disciplined red. You will regret this. I've regretted worse, Thatcher said, and lived. Sorrel had not asked for a rescue, but she was perceptive enough to recognize what form it took when it arrived. Pride said, leave the trunk, leave the town, leave this man who thinks your steps are a debt he must pay each time you move. Wisdom said, drink water, live long enough to choose. She tilted the cane and lifted her chin. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Thatcher, he said simply, and to Cyrus he added without looking, take your fare back and buy a new hatband one. With your own initials. He lifted the trunk without grunting. He did not rush to match Sorrel's pace. He matched hers, like a man willing to walk at the speed truth required. The cane's rhythm found the streets. Sorrel's shame cooled by degrees, replaced with a humbler hunger, to sit, to drink, to be someplace that did not judge the mechanics of her motion before it met her name. Ash Mesa was the color of a sunburnt peach, the buildings packed close as if the wind might steal them if they stood apart. A church steeple tried to rise above the heat and mostly succeeded. The smithy crouched 2 doors down from the pump, its mouth open to let the anvil's breath escape. Inside, the forge was a small red sun. Tools hung on the walls like metal constellations. Thatcher set the trunk near a bench and fetched a tin cup. Slow sips, he said, as if he knew she would try to swallow a river. If you drown after all that travel, I'll never hear the end of it from Mrs. Rios. Mrs. Rios? Runs the laundry. Runs everything, if you ask her. The water was a benediction. She swallowed carefully and felt the dust unclench its fist. Her eyes pricked. She blamed the heat. Thank you, she said, setting the cup precisely on the bench's edge, as if this, too, were a ledger balanced. I can pay a night at Mrs. Rios's if she has a room. And then the boarding house after. Boarding house is full with graders from the railroad, Thatcher said. But there's a loft. He lifted a hand before Sorrel could stiffen. Door has a bolt. Stairs have 2 creaks. I'll show you which. I can pull the ladder after dark. You keep the key. He looked at her in a way that measured nothing. About the tilt of her walk. You did not deserve what he said. They often say it without saying it, she replied. Today he said it. Thatcher's mouth tugged toward a smile that never quite arrived. He will find other words when he wants something from you. What could he want? Sorrel asked, then realized. Ah, the letters. I kept everyone. I'm not ashamed of what I wrote. Good. Shame is a currency rich men like him spend when they're short on cash. He reached for a ledger that lay open on the counter-smudged, functional columns, the careful penwork of a man who tried and who knew his limits. You keep books. You said so. Sorrel nodded. Numbers had been her first language that did not punish her for missteps. In a world that judged how she took a staircase, numbers did not care if she paused on the landing. Show me where I'm losing money, Thatcher said matter of fact, and I'll pay you room and wages. You can decide tomorrow if you want to keep breathing ash meza air. It took him only half a minute to make her feel like a person who had arrived, not like a parcel branded return. She found a stool at the end of the counter firm, not too high. She pulled the ledger closer, and the inked lines steadied the world. The forge's heat baked her shoulders, but the page was cool, the figures crisp. Income from horseshoes, wagon rims, door latches. Outgo for coal, iron, nails, tool repair. A drift of numbers that, if you stood in the current long enough, revealed an undertow. You're being charged double for iron every other order, Sorrel said after a time, feeling the way her mind tucked itself into its familiar niche. That isn't a market swing. That's a man. Which man? The one who knows you don't read every line when you're tired. She tapped a date with her forefinger. This is when the pattern starts. The day before Cyrus Brand's men had driven 2 carloads of cattle through town half, the dust of a storm for free. Thatcher leaned one hip against the counter. He did not crowd her. He stood at a respectful distance that nonetheless made her aware of every place her body ached. Vince Mallory handles freight contracts for Brand. Sorrel did not say I noticed. She did not say the slant of his smile had math in it. Tell me who delivers your iron. Terrell Pooh runs the old freight road. Does he know what he's hauling? Thatcher's look was the kind a man gives a weather vane useful, precise. If he doesn't, Vince does. And if Vince does, Cyrus will call it efficiency and not theft. Sorrel's stomach tightened. Stealing was not always a hand inside a pocket. Sometimes it was a signature that did not deserve the ink it wore. Can we fix it? She asked. We can try. His gaze ticked to her cane and back without getting stuck there. Only if you want a problem with the most powerful man in town. I already have one, she said, and surprised herself with the steadiness of it. He nodded once, a smith's tap sealing something no one else could see. Then we start with paper. Paper travels farther than fists. The town learned who she was in increments, as the woman at the pump, who wrapped a handkerchief twice around the handle so it wouldn't blister her palm, as the one who counted change without making the owner of the hand feel poor, as the stranger who listened to stories at Mrs. Rios's backstoop and laughed in the right places when her laugh wasn't an apology. Children watched from the corner of their eyes, curious about her cane, the way they were curious about thunder. Dogs learned the rhythm of her steps and stopped barking when she passed. Cyrus Brand's gaze cut through streets, the way gullies cut through land after a hard rain. Sorrel could feel it even when he hadn't turned the corner yet, like the pressure in the air before weather breaks. He did not speak to her, not at first, but he spoke near her. She's a liar, Vince Mallory told the storekeeper's wife in a voice designed to travel. Told Brand one story and delivered another. She delivered herself, Mrs. Weathers said tartly, and Sorrel loved her a little for it. When the whispers grew tails and teeth, Sorrel met them the way she met stairs. One measured step, then another. In the smithy, she made a list of receipts to request from Terrell Pooh, a list of questions for the local freight clerk, a list of names to avoid for a while, and a list of names to remember when somebody needed bread. The ledger steadied her. The forge warmed her tights and chased the last damp from travel out of her bones. Thatcher Cole did not hover. He did not play savior in a town that rewarded men for carrying women like saddlebags. He handed her a broom and said, "Sweep the iron filings into the box. I'll sell them back to a man who thinks he's finished with steel." He showed her the bellows lever and said, "Pull when you want more flame. Let go when you can't stand the heat," without looking at anything but her hands. He kept pace when she moved, and when he needed to move faster, he did, and did not apologize for it, and did not make her feel like a chain on his ankle. He was a man in motion. She learned his pattern the way she learned the town, mostly predictable. With a few good surprises, on the third morning, a boy ran in to say a wagon wheel had split near the arroyo. Thatcher grabbed a crate in a bar and said, "Watch the forge. Don't let it die. And if anyone comes asking for me, you're my boss." "I have a cane, not a gun," Sorrel pointed out. "You have a ledger," he said, grinning, and anvil light. Turned the planes of his face into something sculpted. That scares men like Vince more. He was right. Vince arrived 20 minutes after Thatcher left. He leaned one shoulder in the doorway, hat tipped just enough to pass for polite if you were tired or generous. Sorrel was neither. "Afternoon," he said. "Heard you've been snooping in Brand's business." "I've been reading numbers," Sorrel said. "If Mr. Brand's business includes those, that's a coincidence." Coincidence is a fancy word. He eased into the shop with a saunter that put his boots near the anvil, as if he owned shadow and sun. "You still could take that fare home. Brand's generous." "You mean he is generous with his words," Sorrel said. "He's careful with his money." "Sorrel," Vince said, as if they were in on a joke. "You came all this way with that pretty hand and that crooked foot, and thought you'd catch a cattleman. That's ambition. I like ambition. Brand likes order." "If he liked order," Sorrel said, sliding a receipt out of the ledger and laying it on the counter so the ink faced him, "he would pay the price he signed for." Vince glanced, a quick bird peck of his eyes, then looked at her instead. No numbers stuck to his gaze. "Brand won't marry a Limp," he said, "but I'm not Brand." Sorrel had thought she had found all the ways to be insulted. She added a new one to the collection and put it on a high shelf where it would not fall on her head. "Mr. Mallory," she said evenly, "I am a woman with a name and a spine. I keep finding men who only one of those." He laughed without joy. "You talk like a schoolmarm and stand like a question." His fingers brushed the receipt with the deliberateness of a man who knows fire and thinks he can catch it without flame. "Careful you don't end up teaching hungry children with the ache of the world in your stomach. This town can be hard." "I've never met a soft one," Sorrel said. He tipped his hat and left with the air of a man who believed he had planted something. Sorrel watched him go and wrote his name on a third list: "Men who will smile while stealing your shoes." Thatcher returned at dusk carrying the cracked wheel and a gratitude he spread like butter over the smithy. Quietly, thoroughly. He washed his hands, and when the water in the basin ran rusty, he changed it. He looked at Sorrel and at the ledger and at the doorway Vince had leaned against and understood a shape without a sketch. "Mallory came," he said. "He brought a joke and half a threat." "Which half?" "The half where he thinks my dignity is for sale." Thatcher dried his hands and considered something only he could see. Then he set the towel down and turned toward Sorrel with a gravity she felt in her knees. His voice stayed low. A note struck true. "You're not a tool, Sorrel. You're not a ledger. You are not a Limp. If you choose to stay, if you choose to help me keep the forge honest and the books clean, if you choose to build something here." He paused, and the pause was a careful thing, like a smith choosing the point on the iron that could bear a strike. "Then I'm not asking because I pity you. I'm asking because you are exactly what I need." Her breath fluttered, caught, steadied. "Say it plain, Thatcher." He did. "You're all I need." She could not have said why the words fitted. without pinching. Maybe because he did not say "you are all I want," and his wanting felt like a physical thing he could set on a shelf and not break. Need sounded like partnership. Want sometimes sounded like possession. She looked at the ledger, at his hands, at her cane, at the city's color outside the open door. She felt the split here again, a choice that would tell a future who she had been in this moment. "All right," she said. "We fix the iron. We fix what's broken that we can touch." Fixing something starts before a hammer hits. It starts with a witness. Sorrel wrote down every weight and measure on every delivery. She stood at the freight office with her cane and her small, immovable voice and asked to see a docket. She did not apologize for the time it took the clerk to retrieve it. She read the numbers twice, once to hear their tune, once to hear the noise beneath it. The pattern was as deliberate as prayer beads, one fair order, one swollen with padding. The swells always happened when Terrell Pooh hauled freight on weeks when Vince Mallory's name was inked at the bottom of the page. When someone else signed for Brand, the numbers behaved. Clerical error, the clerk said, sweat starting under his collar. "You know how it is." "I do," Sorrel said. "I know exactly how it is when a man thinks the line will blur. If he sweats on it long enough, I'll need copies. Copies cost. I'll pay, then someone else will." The clerk looked at her cane and then, as if embarrassed by his own reflex, looked at her face. Something shifted. "Mrs. Rio's charges. Less for paper," he mumbled. "But you didn't hear that from me." 3 more days taught her where the town cracked and where it held. It cracked at the saloon when a miner laughed too loudly at a girl, and the girl laughed back because girls were taught to laugh before they were taught to read. It cracked at the church when the preacher spoke about charity in a voice that seemed to have never waited for anything. It held in 1,000 small ways. A boy giving his biscuit to a dog. A woman mending a stranger's hem without comment. A blacksmith who put extra nails in a man's barrel because loss had taught him where to reinforce. Cyrus. Brand finally approached her in public 6 days after the platform. She was crossing Main near the depot with a roll of dockets under her arm, and the sun had slid sideways just enough to light the dust into gold. He stepped out from the shade and made a picture of himself for anyone who might be watching. The benevolent man correcting a child. "You are making a spectacle," he said. "I'm making copies," she said. "Spectacles come later." "You sent a request for audit to the territorial office." He smiled as he said it, and the smile had coins in it. "Do you know how long it will take them to answer?" "I know exactly how long it will take you to change how you steal," Sorrel said. "And I aim to make that harder." Cyrus took a step closer, and the calm she had taught herself steeled into something new. Not fight, not flee. Something that looked like root. "You have nerve," he said. "I'll grant you that. I have need," she corrected. "For fairness. For a life that does not treat me like a miscount." He lowered his voice. "Brand men don't forget insults. Women who survive winters don't forget the price of coal." Their eyes held. In that small silence, Sorrel understood a thing she had only felt as pressure before. Cyrus did not hate her. Hate would have been too human. He dismissed her. He considered her a misprint. And misprints angered men who believed the world owed them clean lines. "Walk careful," he said, and his voice was not a threat and not a kindness. It was an instruction issued by a man used to obeying himself. Sorrel thought, "I have been careful my whole life." Out loud she said, "You too." That evening, a note slid under the smithy door in a boy's ragged scrawl. "Meet behind the depot. Terrell Pooh, bring coal." Thatcher read it once and looked at Sorrel. It could be a trap, so could doing nothing. He tilted his head, acknowledging both truths. "I'll fetch the marshal. Marshal Hollis will warn Brand if he thinks it's a misunderstanding," Sorrel said. "Not from malice. From habit. I know skills," Thatcher said. "You know people." He hung up his apron and took down his coat. "We'll go. We'll go together." They left the lamp lit in the smithy's window, the kind of promise one leaves to oneself when stepping into a night that has more eyes than stars. The depot's far side smelled of creosote and secrets. Crates cast long bars across the packed dirt. The tracks sang their little song of heat meeting cool, a quiet click that had comforted Sorrel as a child when other children kept her inside to avoid embarrassment. Terrell Pooh came out of the dark with his hat in his hand. He looked like a man who had caught himself lying to his own reflection. "Didn't know who else to go to," he muttered. "Mallory's got a rope around half my business. I haul what I'm told. The weights, I don't set them. I swear. But I've seen men load extra scrap into the iron crates and charge you new steel." "Names," Sorrel said. "Mallory's boys. The twins, Hal and Harlan Reed." He licked his lips, which made Sorrel think of a horse wishing salt. "And a tall one with a crooked ear. Calls himself judge. He ain't nobody's man. Hires out where the pay shines." Thatcher stepped a half-inch to place himself between Sorrel and the dark beyond Terrell's shoulder. "Why tell us?" "Because I ain't made of numbers," Terrell said, and his voice trembled with the bone-deep honesty of a man who wished he were better and didn't know how to become it without bleeding. "I'm made of days, and the last two felt wrong in my skin." He thrust a small ledger toward Sorrel like a man handing over his last ounce of faith. "This is mine. You can have it. I'll sign my name under it in front of the preacher, if I have to." Sorrel took the book and felt the shake in his hand and didn't let judgment reach for it. "You don't have to prove to me that you were born to do better than you did last week," she said. "Just start doing it." He nodded, a jerky motion like a knot loosening. "I'll walk you back." "You'll walk yourself home," Thatcher said. "We'll be right behind." They waited until Terrell's hat vanished around the corner. Then they moved, unhurried, back toward Maine. Sorrel could feel the night trying to gather them into its pockets. Her cane sank fractionally in the dirt. With each step, the handle grew warm from her grip. She was not afraid in the old way, a fear that counted exits and called herself burden. She was afraid in a newer way, which felt like standing in a doorway while weather gathered on the ridge. It was fear braided with purpose, and it held. "Tomorrow," Thatcher said quietly, "we take this to the freight clerk. The day after, we take it to the judge. And the day after that?" Sorrel asked. "Brand will snarl, Mallory will twist. We will not." They were half a block from the smithy when the world made a thin, decisive sound, the intimate click of a rifle held steady by a patient man. "Don't move," a voice murmured from the alley's mouth. "Calm, too calm. Drop the books." Thatcher touched Sorrel's elbow, a brush of heat and history. He leaned without leaning, to make himself taller where her balance wanted a friend. "You'll want to reconsider," he said to the dark. "Not tonight," the voice answered. "Tonight I get paid." Sorrel turned her head slightly until the alley resolved into shapes: a stack of crates, a rain barrel, a sliver of sky, and a man she did not recognize except by the sum of his intentions, crooked ear, narrow eye, a readiness that did not belong to Ashmus's slower fights. Judge. It must be Judge. He did not look cruel. He looked efficient. She had always known efficiency could be a sin. "Your employer," she said. "Say his name." "Ma'am," he said, polite as a door held for a stranger. "I don't sell names." "Then you only rent your conscience," Sorrel said, and did not look away. "You can still buy it back." A breath of laughter. "You're the one with the limp." "I am the one with the ledger," she said. Her pulse beat in small, urgent drums at her throat. "And the list of weights that will put your employer in front of a judge." "Drop it," he repeated. The rifle's click came again, a second beat on the rosary of this night's prayer. Thatcher's voice lost its edges and became something Sorrel had not yet heard from him. Dangerous, soft as a file on steel. "You fire that gun," he said, "and this town will not hold you. It will spit you out by morning." "Then I'll ride," Judge said, reasonable to the end. 3 seconds. Sorrel did the arithmetic she knew best. Distance from shadow to barrel, height of Thatcher's shoulder, angle to the lamp left burning in the smithy window. 3 seconds was not enough to solve everything. It was enough to become a person she could keep living with. She took a breath, tasted the iron of the night, and made a choice that felt like stepping off a moving cart on purpose. She shifted. Her grip on the cane, tightened her fingers on the little ledger Terrell had given her, and leaned into the space fear wanted her to abandon. The world drew a held breath with her. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." And the laughter trailed after her like burrs caught in a hem, sticking, pricking, refusing to let go. Elowyn Rusk kept her chin high anyway, because the alternative was to let their words drive her head down until shame folded her in half. She would not be folded. Not tonight. Not ever again. Jonas Alder walked a half step to her, left the way a good wind breaks for a weaker flame, letting her set the pace on the wooden walk and not the other way around. He didn't reach for her elbow, though her limp was sharp, and the boards of Blackbriar's main street were uneven where winter had buckled them. He did something better. He matched her stride. That tiny, stubborn mercy steadied her more than a hand could have. "You're certain?" he asked, voice kept low so it wouldn't echo off false-fronted stores and window glass still hot with faces. "County clerk will be shut by now. I can put you in Mrs. Delaney's spare room this evening, and we'll see the judge tomorrow. Or if you want further down the road, I'll hitch the team and keep driving." Elowyn stopped beneath the shadow of the livery's awning, breathing around the ache that always came after too much standing. She had learned to walk through pain the way others learned letters, one careful line at a time. "You said you meant it," she said, and heard the rasp in her throat that the cold always brought. "Back there, in front of them. You're all I need. Men have said worse things to me as a jest. I don't abide jests. I don't either," he said simply. "I meant it. I mean it again now." Her name was still tacked to the notice board outside the stage office where brides arrived and agreements were fetched like parcels. Elowyn Rusk, one trunk, cane, apricot sapling wrapped in burlap. The trunk and the cane made sense to strangers. The tree never did. She felt the weight of it anyway, the way hope could weigh more than iron cookware if you carried it long enough. "Then show me where you live," she said. "If I'm to face a judge in the morning, I'd rather go smelling of soap than smoke." He smiled with one corner of his mouth, a gesture that didn't light his face so much as firm it. "I'll bring the wagon around." The town of Blackbriar rustled with the business of pretending nothing ugly had happened. Doors shut. Music rose from the saloon, the piano suddenly louder than the snickers that had swelled by the depot when Harlan Voss, broad-shouldered, money-handsome, and mean in the way of men who've never been told, no, took one good look at the twist in Elowyn's right foot and said, pleasantly as pouring cream, "No." He hadn't meant only the contract. He had meant no to the person who brought the contract, to the life she had intended to build, to the way she had taught herself to stand with her weight over the good hip and not show a flinch while he counted. Her like cattle. Jonas had said yes in the next breath. He had said it in public, which mattered. He'd said it looking at her face and not her gait, which mattered more. The wagon was plainer than the slick rigs Voss's cattle bosses drove from the stockyards, but the harness was oiled and the lines hung true. Jonas helped her up by offering the rail and waiting. She took it, lifted, set, lifted, set, the two motions of her climb like prayer beads. Once seated, she smoothed her skirt as if that could smooth the day. "Name the sorrel?" she asked, because asking about horses was safer than asking about men. "Wren," he said, settling. "She minds a steady voice." "Good," Elowyn said. Without explaining, she was thinking of herself. They left the lance of black briar behind, and the road unspooled into a long gray ribbon edged with rabbit brush. The air smelled of river silt and the clean iron tang that came when weather broke after heat. The wheel rattle found a rhythm that matched her breath. Jonas kept his eyes on the road and his hands quiet. The good kind of quiet, the kind that didn't ask her to fill it. Where'd you learn to stand? Like that? He asked at last. Like what? As if the whole town were a wind trying to push you over, and you were a fence post they set wrong anyway. She huffed a laugh into the night. In a town that didn't have a name until the railroad needed one, trouble rides in with the wind there too. The only difference is the dust. She tipped her chin toward the black shape swaying in the wagon bed. That's an apricot from my mother's yard. She said fruit trees are stubborn. I believed her. That why you carried it across 3 states. That, and to prove to folks like Harlan Voss that a thing can flower whether or not they think it ought. He digested that without comment, which was another mercy. Silence settled again, lit by crickets. When they reached his place, a square of light in the fold between 2 low hills, Elawan bit the inside of her cheek to keep from saying something foolish. It wasn't grand. 2 rooms shouldered together with a lean-to kitchen tacked on and a windmill higher than the roof, creaking into the sky. But the porch had a chair with a quilt folded on it. The stones by the steps had been laid with a hand that liked pattern. And someone had planted a line of hollyhocks against the fence, their coins of color stamped into moonlight. I thought you said you didn't abide jests, she said when she could breathe around it. He tipped his hat back. I don't. Then, why'd you go and build a place that looks like a promise? He was still looking at her face when he answered. Because some promises are meant to be kept. Inside, the house smelled of cedar shavings and bread gone too long in the oven. Tools lived tidy on pegs. A map of the irrigation ditch was chalked onto the wall. Beside the bed in the smaller room, a low stool waited as if it had always known her, the exact height a woman with a weak ankle needs to sit without twisting. You made that, she said, touching the stool's edge. The workmanship was careful, each corner eased with sand so linen wouldn't snag. I did, he said. Had a hand that doesn't open right after a bad winter's fever, my left. Had to teach it new ways to hold. Makes a man notice smaller tolerances than he used to. She took off her shoe with the lifted heel and set her foot down on the smooth plank. Pressure tingled up her calf. Folks think limps mean you can't learn new ways, she murmured. It's the opposite. All we do is learn new ways. He didn't offer more talk. He showed her the wash basin and the nail for her dress and the door latch that didn't stick. There's a thing about tomorrow, he said at last in the doorway. Clerk Sutter is cousin to Vos on their mother's side. He'll make you feel the bristle of it. Let him try, she said, and let the door settle into its frame. Sleep didn't come at first. The day hung too bright behind her eyes. The platform boards, the flick of Harlan's gaze down and back up as if she were an arithmetic he could solve with a glance. The hotter glances from women who looked at her like bad luck. And Jonas, standing in the shade of it all like a man who didn't care whose anger he borrowed coals from if it meant she could walk by. She lay on her side and listened. Coyotes sang somewhere in the draw. The windmill caught a gust and spun, water talking in the pipe. She counted her breaths, and when counting didn't work, she pictured the apricot snug in damp burlap against her trunk, a green shoot teasing at string. When morning finally took the room, it came soft. She got up stronger than she had any right to. They were at the courthouse when the door latch clicked day open. Elawan wore the blue calico with the neat darts she'd stitched while the train rattled, because a woman ought to present the labor of her own hands when she asks to be believed. Clerk Sutter ran a finger under his collar as if his neck suddenly didn't fit. He had the washed look of men who prefer paper to weather. The ledger on the counter was big enough to feel like a gate. License application, Jonas said. He put his hand flat on the counter. The hand didn't fully open. Elowen saw what he meant last night about the winter fever, but studied just the same. Clerk Sutter didn't reach for a form. He reached for Elowen's face with his eyes and then dropped to the foot she kept. A half step back. Doctor's certificate? He said, oily as a stovetop. Territorial statute allows a clerk to request assurance of health with a contract. Assurance of health for whom? Elowen asked, and made her voice a spoon instead of a knife. People eat better from spoons. For the parties, he said, but his glance skittered to her ankle again, to the careful lift plant of her stance, ability to fulfill responsibilities. You mean children delivered and floors scrubbed? She said, and felt Jonas go very still beside her. I mean what the statute means, Sutter said, which was to say he meant whatever he pleased. Jonas's jaw worked. You didn't ask Harlan Voss for a certificate last spring, he said. Or the autumn before when the widow from Willer's Gap. Sutter's smile polished itself. You're not Harlan Voss. No, Elowen agreed, we're not. She looked down at the ledger with its red margin lines and clean marching columns and felt her temper do a dangerous little reel. Anger made a person uneven. She had learned to hold hers like a water glass you don't want to slosh. You keep that book for names, she said. Write mine in it. If the judge wants a certificate, the judge can ask me himself. The judge is on circuit, Sutter said. 3 days minimum. We'll be here in 3 days, Jonas sighed. Meanwhile, Sutter added with the soft relish of a man who enjoys wedges, the agreement with Mr. Voss remains in my file. He has standing to protest. Elowen felt the air thin. Sutter was right. The paper she'd carried across. States like a talisman still lived here, name and promise and sums in ink. Harlan could take that ink and turn it into a no that lasted longer than the one he'd spoken at the depot. He could turn it into a 20-mile circle around her life and call it law. Jonas must have felt her sway because he stepped half an inch. Closer, not touching. Close enough that she could feel the heat from his arm. We'll wait for the judge, he said. You can go ahead and frown at us, Sutter. We'll try not to let it ruin our day. Sutter's mouth tried at a shape. That wanted to be a smile and failed. Your day may take care of the ruining itself, he said. There's a drought coming. Ditches will be law this season. Jonas picked up the blank form Sutter had refused to fill and folded it twice, precise. Then it's a blessing that my ditch was measured straight. They left the courthouse with the ledger still shut and the sun already shouldering into the street. Elowen's breath came the way it always did after someone pressed her to the wall with polite words. Too shallow, too quick. She made it deep on purpose. 3 days, Jonas said. We'll plant your apricot today. If a tree can wait and still bear, we can too. He put her in the wagon again as if placing something he valued. On the way home he stopped at Delaney's Mercantile. May Delaney herself came out from behind the bolts of muslin, her gray hair braided and coiled like rope. She looked Elowen up and down the way women look when they are choosing whether they will help you in small ways or harm you with small words. You the one he said, you're all I need to? May asked. The corner of her mouth ticked. Bold. Thing to say in front of Voss's men, made it sweeter. Elowen lifted her chin. I don't care about sweetness. Good, May said. It rots teeth. You'll take flour, bacon, bluing, 2 cakes of soap, and a roll of this. She thumped a bolt of firm cotton on the counter. You can make your own curtains. I'll put it on Jonas's tab and glare at him later. Back at the homestead, Elowen sat on the stool and hemmed the curtains while Jonas dragged the old plow to the east-facing rise and dug a neat pit for the apricot. He moved like a man who knew the marriage of tool and hand was holy. She watched his left fingers do their clumsy best to knot the guy rope for the sapling stake and put her needle down. Let me, she said, bringing the twine to her lap. I've tied 1,000 smaller knots than this. Her hands worked, the rhythm familiar. She'd learned to knot quick because other folks grew impatient when she walked slow. It was a way of making the ledger balance. The strings yielded. The stake held. The sapling trembled into certainty instead of sway. They watered it from a bucket hauled by the windmill. Ilawan pressed her palm to the damp earth. A message, we're staying. Grow toward it. They ate bread and jam at the stoop while shade crawled. Across the yard, Jonas told stories with the economy of a man who doesn't assume his words are the table's main dish. He'd come south after watching his father lose a season to drink, and then 2 seasons to pride. He'd bought the place with a stack of coins and a promise to a bank manager who liked his way of measuring fence posts. He'd cut the ditch at a grade he was quietly proud of. Ilawan, he said at last in a voice that stayed gentle though. The subject turned harder. Some of Harlan's cowboys will test the fence, on principle. He thinks principles are his to play with. She thought of the courthouse ledger, of ink that made itself bigger than flesh. Then we'll keep the hammer by the gate, she said. By late afternoon clouds stacked bruised on the horizon. Jonas took Ilawan to the barn. The Mare wren snorted and nosed Ilawan's sleeve. The saddle Jonas lifted down had been altered with a second strap and an extra loop, leather polished where someone had tested buckles again and again until they held just right. I tried something, he said, looking suddenly self-conscious. The loop can catch your right knee so you don't bear the twist on the stirrup. If you hate it, we cut it off and no harm done. Ilawan's throat tightened around words she hadn't known she'd been saving. Not gratitude exactly, recognition. Help me up, she said, and he did, his palm a sure shelf at her waist. It took 3 tries to get her weight settled without tugging the ache into scream. She breathed, closed her eyes, breathed again. Then the trick of it arrived the way a hard idea sometimes does, sideways and all at once. She set her knee in the loop. The stirrup carried the weight that had punished her for years. The Mare shifted, and the world did not tilt under Ilawan. A laugh slipped out of her without permission, a bright, astonished thing. Jonas blew out a breath he'd been holding as if the whole town had been perched on his ribs. Walk her, he said. Slow. As you please. Ilawan rode a circle, then another. The barn light caught dust motes and turned them to tiny planets slowly orbiting. She could have wept for the simple grace of not fearing the next step. She did not. She pressed her palm flat against her thigh so it would remember. They were at the gate when the first shout came from the lane. 2 riders. Voss's colors on. Their bandanas, though colors in this country were mostly dust. They crowded the opening in that careful, careless way cowhands have, when they want trouble to happen, but want the trouble to say it arrived of its own accord. Fences 2 inches. Onto public right-of-way, the one with the scar along his jaw said without greeting. I was sent to say, Jonas rested his forearm on the gatepost. You were sent to lean on a thing that wasn't going to fall anyway. We could always help it along, Scar said. Ilawan slipped her right leg from the loop and swung down. Slow, not timid, honest slow. She put her cane under her hand and walked until she stood in front of the man's horse. The horse shifted, sensitive to small changes the way prey animals must be. She put her hand up and cupped the air near its nose, not quite touching. That close, her voice would be the thing the animal heard best. If you break 1 board, she said softly, we will mend 2. If you cut wire, we'll string 6. She lifted her gaze to the rider, met his eyes, let him see that not all of a person's strength lived in how they moved across a room. And if you come after what the judge hasn't ruled on yet, it won't be the fence that embarrasses you. The scarred man's mouth did a thinking thing. He flicked his reins. They backed their horses out a step. Tell the lady we were polite, he said to Jonas, as if Ilawan weren't there at all. Best tell her yourself. Jonas said. They went, but with that loose seat rider's us. Even the first retreat is only the practice run for another approach. Ilawan waited until the dust settled before she let her breath go. By sundown, the clouds had walked closer. A wind pastured itself in the cottonwoods. Jonas went to check. The sluice where the ditch met the creek. Ilawan lit lamps and set the curtains on the line she'd rigged along the kitchen wall. When he came back, he smelled like water and angle iron. "Gates sticking on the north head," he said, and rolled his shoulder like a man trying to shake a pinch. "Then tomorrow we oil it," she said. And the day after we oil it again. She meant to say more. The night took the rest of it. There are sounds a woman learns to treat as thunder even when there's no storm. Boot leather hush and grass. The glass note of a bottleneck touching. A nail head. Rope sliding over a beam. The hair rose on Ilawan's forearms before she heard the first tiny roar. Fire thinks in one language. "It needs only fuel and a way to climb, Ilawan," Jonas said, and his voice had no room in it for anything but the next motion. Barn. By the time they reached the yard, the shadow at the eaves had turned orange at the edges. Someone's had laid a line of lamp oil from the tackroom door to the straw pile and touched it with a match. A clever, mean fire. The kind that pretends to be small even while it's memorizing how the rafters are built. Animals first, Ilawan said, because there are orders that have to be kept. She caught up the nearest bucket and doused the threshold where the flame licked. Jonas disappeared into smoke, came out with the bay gelding's lead rope in his good hand, and shoved the horse toward the corral with his shoulder when the gelding balked. Ilawan went for Ren. The mare's eyes rolled white. "Steady," Ilawan whispered into the soft triangle beside her ear. "Steady, steady." She looped the lead and walked, close enough to feel heat on her face, slow enough that the horse remembered walking is a thing she knew how to do. From the far stall, Gulliver, the mule with the wide, foolish face and a grudge against halters, screamed. His opinion of the whole affair, Jonas swore once. "Leave him," he said. "Stubborn bastard will kill you." "I know stubborn," Ilawan said, and dragged a wet gunny sack over her hair. She wished for the loop in the saddle and then hated herself for the wish. Feet were the only thing that would keep her upright in there. "He's mine." The smoke hit her in the doorway like a shove. She counted steps by the way the boards gave underfoot and reached Gulliver's stall by memory and sound. The mule. Through his head wild. She spoke low and steady, hands on the gate, mind set to the long work of persuasion. Pain made the edges of her thoughts bright and strange. She gathered them in like dropped pins. "Listen," she told the animal as if the animal could hear the entirely different conversation she was having with herself. "You don't get to decide what I can't do. That job is taken." Gulliver blew, rank and scared. And then, because some creatures will always choose a voice they trust over a door they hate, he followed. They came out into a yard that had turned red around the edges. Jonas met them, eyes streaming, hair singed at the brow. He gripped Ilawan's elbow once, quickly, in the half-second between crisis and the next crisis, and then turned back because the roof had begun the hollow, shouting that roofs do when their beams know they are going to fail. Neighbors run toward fire the way others run from it, all of them telling the same lie, that they can outrun a collapse if they're fast enough. May Delaney arrived with 2 men and a pump. The men took the pump. May took Ilawan's face between her hands and said, "Breathe through your teeth. Smoke won't bite as hard." They fought it past midnight. They lost the loft and saved the walls. They kept the flames from the house by breaking the small fence between barn and kitchen garden themselves, a hurt that felt indecent and necessary at once. When at last the fire fell to sulk and spit, Ilawan sank on the stoop, wet to the skin with sweat and water both, and watched the last sparks hunt excuses for staying. It would have been a victory, even charred. It would have been a story she could carry into the judge's chamber to explain why the smell of smoke had moved into her hair. It would have been Jonas? May said, voice changed. Alawan didn't move her head. She didn't have to. She felt the change come into the yard, the way a room feels a new thought pressure altering. There were men in the lane. More than. The two from afternoon. Their horses breathed like bellows. Spurs clicked. One man laughed softly in a voice that liked to hear itself in the dark. Harlan Voss stepped into the range of the lantern. He had left off his hat, as if respectful, which made it worse. 5 men fanned behind him. Scarjaw was one. Another wore a scarf up over his mouth the way a bank clerk might if he had suddenly discovered courage and wished to hide it. Terrible thing, Harlan said, easy as a man admiring pies. Fire, jumps where it will. Ilawan pushed herself to her feet and was oddly righted by the pain, as if the body, overloaded, decided to choose one misery and steady itself around that. You need a judge to say your words for you, Mr. Voss? She asked. Or can you do it yourself? His smile sharpened. I'm capable. You've tied yourself to a man with a ditch that trespasses, a mortgage that squeals when wind hits. It and a name that doesn't open doors. He tipped his chin toward the barn. Would be a shame if more weather came through while you waited 3 days for a circuit. Judge to decide you're too tender for the contract you thought you wanted. Ilawan, Jonas murmured, and when she glanced she saw the angle of his body shift, protect and attack at once. Go inside. She didn't. What is it you're after? She asked Harlan. Say the part you came prepared to say. Harlan brought a slip of paper from his vest. Not paper. A fuse. It lay across his palm like a bright white worm. He held it toward the lantern and smiled the way men smile at cards when the hand is theirs. You've got grain left in the granary. I reckon. Kerosene in the shed. It's a dry country. Jonas took one step. 2 of Harlan's men lifted their rifles, and the muzzles drew perfect little circles in the lamplight. Scarjaw's lip did that thinking shape again, and then smoothed. The thinking had decided to serve the money. If you sign a release, Harlan said, turning so the men could see his profile like a photograph of a benevolent donor. Seeding. Water from the East Branch, and agreeing not to contest the prior contract you ripped up in your head, but not in my file. I might be so moved by neighbor feeling that I forget how quickly sparks travel. You mean you'll let us keep the walls we kept ourselves if we hand you the ditch that keeps them standing? Ilawan said. That's the poetry of it, he said, rolling the fuse between finger and thumb. Shame as I never cared for. Poetry. May Delaney stood as if she had found a new bone and didn't know yet how to stand with it. Put that thing away, she said, voice flat. You set fire to 1 more ounce of this place, and you'll have the churchwomen at your door with buckets of words you can't douse. Harlan's eyes slid to May and then back to Ilawan. He had always preferred audiences that hurt more when he stepped on them. 3 days is a long time, he said to Ilawan as if they were alone in a room. Men can be convinced to change their minds, so can ladies who limp when it rains. Ilawan was tired enough to see through to the bones of a thing. The anger she usually held so carefully in a spoon had tipped and spilled. It ran down her arm and warmed her hand. She stepped until the lantern filled her whole eye, and made the rest of the world only shadow beyond it. This is what you're missing, she said, and heard the scrape of her own voice steady itself on something fierce and clean. I'm not the same woman who stepped off a stage and stood still because a man said no. I don't stand still for men who say no anymore. Harlan made a small pleased shape with his mouth, as if he had been waiting for this all along, as if he liked his opponents to announce themselves before he set the board on fire. Then here's my yes, he said, and nodded to the man with the scarf high over his nose. The man struck a match dot. It was a loud sound in the new quiet, the angry sandpaper hiss of sulfur learning to burn. The man lifted the match toward the fuse. Ilawan knew, in the particular slow way the body knows when a fall is already happening, that she could not reach him in time. Her cane was a country mile too short. Her foot was a second too late. Jonas lunged, but 2 rifles caught his motion in their sights. The match head wore a perfect bead of fire. It kissed. The fuse woke. It hissed like a snake making up its mind. It ran like a white line learning to become black. Someone laughed. Another ugly soft sound. The hiss carried toward the shed where the stench of kerosene had soaked into the threshold. When they dragged the cans earlier, and all Ilawan could do for one terrible, crystalline instant was watch. The flame traveled. Fast, too fast. Harlan's smile widened at a speed to match it. Jonas. She breathed, and tasted smoke and metal and the sudden bright copper of fear in her mouth. The fuse arrowed into the shed's dark. It found the first splash of oil waiting in the dust. The flame swelled like a held breath. It was going to take everything. And then the flame guttered. Not out, not mercy. Just that stutter a fire makes when it meets water it didn't plan for. Ilawan saw why in the same heartbeat Jonas swore. At her feet, the packed earth around the shed mouth gleamed dark. The mud they'd made fighting the barn blaze had crawled this far and pooled in the hollow where the sill was low. The lit fuse hissed, flamed, choked, flamed again, eating through wet toward the dry darkness inside where the kerosene waited. Don't you dare, Ilawan whispered to the fire, and to her fear, and to the version of herself that watched disasters. From the far side of glass. She moved without asking her ache if it would allow it. Cane down, weight set. She jabbed the hook of the cane's crook sideways, caught the fuse like a snake behind the head, and levered. The burning string flipped from the sill and writhed into the puddle. Steam leapt. The hiss turned thin, a high, angry whine. More water. She said, because it's easier to command water than men. And May was already there, with a bucket that slopped like a full heart. The first throw drowned the inching fire entirely. The second made sure the drowning had no afterthoughts. Harlan's smile changed shapes and failed to find one that fit his face. The men behind him shifted in that unsure way men do when the thing they came to watch doesn't go the way they practiced it in their minds. Scarjaw's horse tossed and stamped. The man's hand went to the reins out of reflex more than decision. Jonas stepped into Ilawan's shoulder, as if the two of them were a hinge, and he were the leaf designed to brace from behind. His breath ran ragged in and out from smoke and sprinting. Inside, he said low, his mouth close to her hair. Now, Ilawan didn't back up. The pain in her ankle had brightened to a narrow white that drew a clean line through the rest of the night. She walked along it like a tightrope. Mr. Voss brought a story, she said, voice steady. We interrupted it with buckets. I suppose he wants to begin again at the top. Neighbor woman with a mouth, Harlan observed, easy. He had found another smile to try on. This one had sympathy painted on it with a brush that didn't match the rest of him. This is a water year with a mean streak. I came to make an offer that keeps your man from wasting what little he's got left on lawyers and tools. You signed the contract with me, Miss Rusk. I carried a paper across 3 states, Ilawan corrected. The part with the ink in. Your drawer is not the part that counts. The part that counts is the part I didn't owe you, the choosing. Choice is a luxury, Harlan said. Water's a law. Law smells a lot like your fuse tonight, May Delaney said, stepping to Ilawan's side with her bucket in hand like an extra argument. Sulfur and brag. Harlan looked at May the way men look at rocks in the road, noticed chiefly for their position, not their nature. 3 days, Miss Rusk. Clerk Sutter holds the paper. Judge returns on the 3rd sunrise. Between now and then, weather could do terrible things. So could memory. Men forget what they were sure of. Women, too. He nodded at the drowned fuse. I'll be neighborly and leave a length of new line in case you think better and want to signal me sooner. We'll light lamps when we want. Light, Ilawan said. He tipped an invisible hat, which was worse than a real one, and he knew it. Then he and his men turned their horses and were swallowed by the dark. They left quiet behind them that didn't feel like peace. It felt like a string pulled taut. The yard held still as if listening to what had just been decided. Jonas let out a breath that shivered at the edges. May put a palm flat on Elowen's back between her shoulder blades. The place, Elowen thought. Distantly, where wings would sprout if a person were born with better plans. "Come inside," May said. "We'll scrape the smoke out of our throats with coffee." They sat at the table with cups that trembled when they set them down and made a list the way hard nights demand lists. Boards to pull where the heat had. Cooked resin to brittleness. Nails to salvage. Slats for the granary repaired first, not last, because Harlan had shown them what he meant to test. Jonas wrote slowly with his right hand and used the left to keep the page from skittering. His bad fingers lay crooked and brave, refusing to be useless. Elowen counted what she could count: rags, buckets, stamina, and did not count fear, sleep. Jonas said, when the list was long enough to be honest, "We take turns." "May, please. I'm too old to be told, and I'm staying," May said. "You two lie down first. I'll wake you when it's your watch. If any of Voss's cowhands are fool enough to show before dawn, they can listen to me recite every price I have ever charged their boss for kerosene until they weep." Elowen lay down because refusing help is another way to make a wound worse. She slept badly and woke hard, and the sun found them already at their work. Morning began with hammer talk. Nails in, nails out. The barn walls smudged and streaked, and standing, the mule, newly more respectful of Elowen, stood where she told him and did not bite the currycomb once. Wren lowered her head into Elowen's shoulder. With a sigh, Elowen tried not to turn into her own. After chores they walked the fence. It is a truth about fences that walking them tells you what you're fighting, and sometimes who. A top wire sagged in a place where no wind had rights to it. A post had a fresh split in the grain where an impatient boot could have worried a weakness wider. Elowen wrote the breaks in a neat hand on the back of a seed catalog. She also wrote down the shape of a boot print with a bent toe and a missing heel nail, not for the sheriff because they did not have a sheriff here yet, but for her own ledger of who had chosen what dot at the north head. Where the ditch met the creek, Jonas crouched. The gate's iron slide had seized in its track. Wet grit and a shallow dent from a pry bar told a story a man with hands could read. He worked the pin loose with a patience that made his jaw clench, and his breath careful. "Someone tested it," he said without turning his head. "If I hadn't wedged this chalk last week, the gate would have jumped out of frame. We'd have lost the bank." Elowen knelt too, slow, making peace with the way pressure sang in her ankle. The water that slid past them was the quietest thing in the county and the most powerful. "They wanted a flood," she said. "They'll want a drought tomorrow. Whichever writes their name over ours." He looked at her then, and the look did something to the inside of her ribs, a rearranging. "We've got 3 days," he said. "I can shore this enough to hold if I don't sleep." "You will sleep," she said, and the voice that came out of her belonged to someone who had been elected by nobody and still expected to be obeyed. "And you'll eat, hear me?" He smiled with the corner of his mouth, grateful without the humiliation some men mix into the recipe. "I do." They walked back slow. At the gate, a scrap of paper snagged in the wire rattled like a drunk locust. Elowen caught it. A line of figures marched across the page, numbers clean as a clerk's conscience. She recognized Sutter's hand from the courthouse totals. The heading read East Branch Allotment, April-August, and under it columns divvied. Water into tidy sections of day as if creeks obeyed hours. Voss's name had more of those hours than the creek had water. Dropped by accident, Jonas said, except his voice knew it hadn't been an accident, or on purpose to say what he plans. "It's both," Elowen said. "It's a threat, disguised as bookkeeping." She folded the paper and slid it into her bodice. Paper carried in a woman's dress is a thing men remember when they make choices later. Before noon they had visitors. Not cowhands, wives. 4 of them with skirts brushing dust and boots built for standing at stoves. They came with their mouths set and their baskets full. Sourdough, a coil of hose, a jar of salve for burns. Eloan's first instinct was to refuse the way proud people call refusal strength when it is only the old fear of owing. She changed her mind before it made it into words. "We'll take the hose," she said, "and your names." "Names?" asked Selgrady, who had a braid. Like a hawser in freckles, she'd long ago given up hiding. "For the judge," Eloan said. "I want to show him more than numbers." She brought them to the table and set out paper, as if the paper were lunch. "You'll write you want the East Head Fair. You'll write your children drink out of that ditch. You'll write what happens when the school's pump goes dry while Mr. Voss waters his 3rd pasture for show." Selgrady looked at the pen like an old enemy she'd learned to truce with. "He'll call us women who don't know law." "He'll be right," Eloan said. "We know thirst." They wrote until the room smelled of ink and resolve. May Delaney arrived mid-signing with a sack of beans and more names folded into her apron. 2 teamsters who'd hauled boxes to Sutter's office and didn't like what they'd seen in those boxes. A boy whose older brother worked night watch at the powder company and had noticed a spool of blasting fuse charged to a ranch account that shared a fence with Eloan's yard. Eloan wrote the boy's story down too, without heat, because words written hot wrinkle later and won't lie. Flat under a judge's hand. By late day, the sky performed its trick of pretending to be empty while full of weather. Jonas came in with news the way he carried water, not to spill it. North Head's wedged true. But someone cut at the south culvert. The bank didn't slough by grace. It sloughed because a boot stomped the clay where it was green. He didn't ask if she could walk that far. He handed her her cane. She went. On the path they passed the apricot, its leaves tender as tongues, its stem flexing under a wind it was still learning. Eloan palmed the stake and tested its give. "Hold, little thing," she said. "We're learning together." At the south culvert, the sabotage was plain. A chunk of sod just large enough to matter had been prized from the quay and set where water would take it. A heel mark bit deep at the edge. A skitter of crushed grass rode an arrow toward the Voss. "Range." Jonas set his jaw and fetched the shovel. Eloan slid down the bank on her left hip so her right would not knock against roots. She pressed the sod back where it belonged, fit by fit, as if she could teach it memory with her fingers. When her ankle protested, she talked to it like she would talk to a frightened mule. It held. "For now, that's all you ever buy in a fight." Like this, a little now, they were not alone while they worked. Men watched from a distance that could be called coincidence if anybody later asked under oath. Scarjaw among them, his horse chewing idly at a patch of weeds already chewed down. To nothing. Eloan kept her face toward the shovel and her mind toward the next inch of ditch, but she did not forget they had an audience. "You'll put on a clean shirt for the judge," Jonas said as they walked home in the red evening, meaning he would. And meaning he wanted her not to think herself smaller than any room. "Maybe I'll wear my work skirt," she said. "Let him see what law sits on when it sits in our kitchen." That night they slept in turns again, 3 hours apiece. Eloan's dreams were a jug of water that emptied when she tried to drink. She woke thirsty enough to laugh at it and went outside to the windmill, where the night made the pump sound like an old woman telling the same story twice because it deserved to be heard. On the second day, Clerk Sutter sent a note in a neat envelope to say the judge had been delayed by a wheel thrown on the road from ridges. Eloan pinched the bridge of her nose hard enough to make stars in daylight and went back to the lists. Jonas hauled lumber. May Delaney argued with a bolt supplier about the price of bolts and won by making the man say the price out loud twice. The women came back with more names. Selgrady's signature had a new firmness to it. The schoolteacher's was precise enough to build a porch on dot at noon. A boy rode hard with his mouth wide around his teeth. Voss cut the community spigot. He gasped without dismounting. Says it leaks. Says he don't have time for other folks' drips. They gathered at the corner where the spigot lived, a leaky iron mouth set in a pipe the town had buried together seasons ago, when someone decided a shared thing was a better bet than waiting their turn at private wells that ran dry and mean. Summers, the valve wheel had been removed and the stem greased. A notice hung admonishing citizens about trespass and liability. It was Sutter's handwriting again, or one that had eaten ink at the same school. Elowen put her palm on the cold iron. Whose yard is this? She asked. It's everybody's, the schoolteacher said. Which means it's nobody's when a man with a stamp wants it. I want it, Elowen said. Not as a claim. As a sentence that could fit other words behind it. May Delaney, who did not like being told and lived happily in the contradiction of liking to be asked, nodded once. I brought a wrench, she said, producing one from a basket that had lied about only containing biscuits. She handed it to Jonas. I can do this, Elowen said. He didn't argue. He stood behind her in that not-touching way that still felt like hands. She fitted the wrench teeth to the grooved end of the stem and leaned with her weight and her stubborn. The metal groaned the way old knees do when a person asks them to stand longer than they want to. The wheel moved a quarter turn, another. Water coughed up from the throat of the pipe and then steadied to a clear run that looked like a lot until you remembered. How many mouths in a town? Someone cheered. Someone else cried. It is possible to cry at a spigot without shame when the week has taught you what water is truly for. Write that in your ledger. May told the few men who stood at the far edge of the crowd with the expression of people who enjoy saying later that they had had doubts. Write that a woman opened a thing you shut. They took turns filling pails as if taking turns at a prayer. Elowen drank from her cupped hand and felt the cool run all the way down to the anger in her belly and smooth some of it. She dried her hands on her skirt and looked toward the ridge road where the judge had not yet appeared, and heard a thought arrive in her mind like a nail finding a pilot hole. He'll say I'm too much trouble, she murmured, not because she believed it about herself, but because she knew Harlan would sell it. Then will be more trouble, May said. On the third morning the air had that shine it gets before heat has its say. Jonas had shaved as close as he could and still looked like the end of a long week. Elowen braided her hair flat and tied it with blue calico. She wore the work skirt and the good blouse. The apricot's leaves had learned a new green overnight. She touched one and let it touch her back. The stage clattered into Blackbriar with its usual drama. The judge stepped down with less. Judge Caldwell was a square man with a precise beard and the habitual squint of someone who reads more than he sleeps. He nodded to Clerk Sutter, didn't look at Harlan first, which Elowen took as a small victory, and set his bag on the courthouse steps. Docket says water, he announced, and drew a small unhappy sound from the crowd that formed as if crowds were the plant most apt to grow in the soil. Docket says contract, Harlan said smoothly. And health where contract contemplates duties a lady may not fulfill. The judge's eyes cut to Elowen's cane and away again with restraint that was either kind or practiced. We'll hold it at Delaney's, he said. Shade and chairs. Sutter, bring the book. May's store turned courtroom with the efficiency of a woman who has turned her store into a church and a wakehouse and a school before, sometimes all in the same week. 2 barrels became a bench. A bolt table became a bar. The bell from the door kept trying to make each witness into an arrival, announced by a cheerful tink. Elowen stood by the window where the light could find her face. Jonas stood 1 pace behind, and to her left, as if some part of him was a compass that understood true north better, standing slightly off-center. Harlan began, the way men like him prefer to begin, with paper. He produced the contract she had carried, the one with her name spelled right and her mother's town spelled wrong. the one Sutter had filed and dust had kissed. He produced a note from a bank about Jonas's debt, as if money were a character. Witness. He produced a sheet that made Eloan's spine go cold before she read more than the first line. Medical opinion, it said in letters tidy enough to feel like poison put into bottles by a conscientious clerk. Territory allows for common-sense precautions, Harlan said, letting the paper sit where the judge could see it. A marriage is a labor arrangement as much as anything. Mr. Alder is entitled to a helpmeet who can perform the work envisioned by the parties. I regret Miss Rusk's infirmity more than I can say. Her courage is admirable, but courage doesn't irrigate fields. Jonas made a sound. Eloan put her hand back without turning her head and found his knuckles and squeezed once. He bit the sound in half and swallowed what was left. Judge Caldwell rayed. He frowned. He looked up. Who wrote this? A doctor, Harlan said. In Willer's Gap. Which doctor in Willer's Gap? May asked from the doorway in a tone that said she had already decided not to approve of the answer. Dr. Pembry, Harlan said, commitment twinning with the name so if it fell it would take him with it. Dr. Pembry set my Willie's arm crooked. And told my Molly her lungs were offended by housework, Selgrady said from the back. He's a man whose prescriptions have always been money forward. The judge kept his face studiedly blank, but penned a small note on a scrap and slid it under the medical paper like a stone under a weak table leg. Miss Rusk, he said, do you wish to reply? Judge Caldwell raised his brows at Sutter, who stood stiff as a yardstick behind the bolt table. The file, he said. Sutter opened the book as if it might bite his hand. He turned pages. He frowned. He turned more. The book, which had always been a door Harlan could walk through without knocking, was suddenly a door that refused to find its knob. The schedule, Harlan prompted. The allotment. Don't play shy now. Sutter swallowed. The schedule is mislaid. Eloan let the moment sit one heartbeat longer than anyone else could bear, and then took the folded sheet from her bodice and set it on the bolt table without looking at Sutter. You mean this schedule? She said gently. I found it caught in Jonas's fence. Paper travels in this country when it's ashamed of where it started. A ripple went through the room that sounded like praise disguised as surprise. The judge read fast and then slower, his finger ticking down columns and halting when Voss's name appeared too often in too few days. This is not allocation, he said. This is appetite. We have cattle, Harlan said, and obligations. So do the rest of them, May said, tilting her chin toward the women, men at Eloan's back. Their cattle are children who drink when there's water and cry when there isn't. The judge let the room breathe and then pinned it with process. I will walk the site, he said. Today, Sutter, you'll come. Mr. Voss, bring your foreman if you like. Miss Rusk, Mr. Alder, show me what you contend. We'll do it under the same sun. They went together because that is how towns do it when something bigger than the usual day is about to be decided. The procession looked like a harvest festival that had lost its music people moving in the same direction for different reasons. At the north head, the judge studied the track marks and the dent in the slide. At the south culvert, he crouched where Eloan had crouched and touched the sod plug with a finger, as careful as a mother testing for fever. Intent, he said softly, not looking at anyone. And not theirs. He meant Jonas and Eloan. He might as well have said Harlan. He didn't, because judges who are any good let the facts say the name so the names stick harder. They walked back along the ditch bank. Eloan's ankle burned and then numbed and then again. She kept her pace because she understood something about not being seen to falter when a judge is in your field. Harlan rode along the far side, hat on for once, expression careful. The way men hold a fractured teacup and try not to show the crack dot at the gate. The judge paused. The creek had fattish shoulders from a rain farther up country. The head box took the water and let what it could into the ditch and shouldered the rest back to the main run. saying no like a polite clerk who knows the inventory. Judge Caldwell nodded. Sound, he said. Who set that chalk? Jonas, Elowin said proudly, and heard the pride surprise her with its plainness. The judge grunted what could have meant anything. He opened his mouth to propose an interim order, which is the law's word for common sense said aloud, and a rider came like bad news with spurs on. He hauled his horse to a stop so sharp the animal had to dance sideways to keep its feet under it. South Bank, he shouted. The bank gave. The head box twisted. Water's running wild. He pointed past the cottonwoods toward Voss's lower acres. It's heading straight for Barron's Wash. If it jumps the cut, it'll take the road, too. Harlan's face did two things at once. Worry for his grass, calculation for his advantage. There, he said to the judge, loud enough to sound like prophecy fulfilled. Waste. Judge Caldwell didn't waste breath. Go. He said to no one in particular, and everyone. All of you, Mr. Alder Tools. Miss Rusk, he caught himself before the rest of the sentence. The part that would have said you stay, because he had seen her keep pace and say her piece and open a town spigot. He changed it mid-breath. Miss Rusk, bring whoever knows. Your ditch best. Elowin already had her cane under her hand, and her body leaned the way a body leans when it has decided to go. Jonas ran for the barn and came back with the shovel and 2 lengths of board and the iron bar for the slides. May seized 3 boys by their shirt collars and turned them into a bucket brigade without asking their mothers. Harlan spurred his horse and took the far bank at a gallop. Scarjo followed with his teeth bared, which could have meant fear or relish or a bit of both. The sound reached them before they saw the break. Not the roar of a river. The worst sound of water that has decided to be a river where no river belongs, an insistent, tearing rush as the bank surrendered and the ditch lost its shape. The south box had indeed jumped a skosh in its frame enough that the water found a new seam and worried it open like a smart fox finding a chicken wire's weakness. A dirty tongue of flow licked at the bank, pulled, took, and went on taking. Below, Voss's lower pasture lay like a bride waiting for a dress it had no right to and would not fit. Boards, Jonas said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The panic around him had voices enough. His lent shape to it instead. Elowin slid down the bank on her left side and felt a trick of balance arrive in her body like a remembered song. She set one board into the fresh gouge. Heel of her hand braced on the top edge. Cane planted in the mud where it wouldn't skate. Jonas jammed the bar into the slide track and hauled. The metal shrieked. The gate moved the width of a thumbnail and then another. Sandbags, May called, and boys appeared with sacks that had been feed and would now be walls. They stacked, they bled, they fell, they stood again. The judge threw with all the unwieldy solemnity of a man who writes for a living and had just remembered he had a body too. Sutter tried not to get wet and failed. The water fought back because that's what water does. It found a new seam by Elowin's knee and rushed at her like a dog trying a new approach to the same fence. Her cane skated. Her bad foot slid into muck that held like hands. She gritted her teeth and planted the cane deeper. Her whole world narrowed to the inch of board and the weight of water and the certainty that if she let go this inch would become a foot and then a yard and then a tifa. Story about a woman who almost holed, Jonas said, as if he were speaking to the ditch and to her and to himself. His voice found her through the noise the way his step had found her pace on the first night. A boulder rolled from the cut above, bumped a sack and knocked the sack into the flow. The sack swung like a pendulum and thudded Elowin's shin before, catching against the board. Pain sparked up through bone, bright as the match that had almost eaten their house. She didn't scream because screaming spends breath. She grunted and breathed and pressed. "Give me your knee," Jonas said. He wedged his hip behind hers so the board had 2 bodies making it taller. The water climbed them both like a ladder and failed to get past the rung they made with their stubborn. Harlan arrived on the far bank, saw the angle of the break, and did a clever thing that would have earned him admiration if he had ever learned. To spend it on others, he sent 2 of his men to the lower field to cut a shallow relief trench that would take the runaway spill to a swale instead of to Barron's Wash. "Do it clean," he shouted. "No slop." Iloan's arm shook. The ache that lived in her ankle had broadened and become a bass note that made the rest of the music richer and harder. She thought about the apricot's small leaves and the apricot's deeper roots and the way both of those facts could be true at once. She thought about the national habit of underestimating women who walk different. She thought about the 3 days baking like a stone in the sun. "Almost," Jonas said. "Almost, Iloan." The gate answered to the iron at last. The slide ground into the slot it had jumped. The flow checked, sputtered, multiplied into smaller violences that were easier to manage. The men with the relief trench signaled. Water took their offered path like a guest who had been shown a better room. They held until the fight changed shape. Then they eased their board out inch by inch, replaced inches with sacks, replaced sacks with tamped soil. When Iloan let the board go entirely, her hands felt empty and too light, the way a person feels after laying down a weight they forgot was part of them. The ditch ran again with the sound of a thing doing the job it was built for. People breathed the way they had forgotten to. Sal Grady laughed a laugh that would have startled teacups in a nicer place, and then pressed her hand over her mouth as if she'd been too familiar with joy in public. Harlan turned his horse and looked along the new course the spill had taken. His face had not decided whether to scowl or nod. In the end, it did neither. He rode back without word, which in him was the closest he came to applause. The judge wiped his forehead with a clean handkerchief and then realized clean was done for the day and put the handkerchief back for a cleaner day. "Interim," he said, breathless, "is this. No one touches that gate without Mr. Alder present. Water turns alternate hours before sundown and after sunrise until I write a schedule that doesn't embarrass this county. And Mr. Voss will contribute labor to the North Head shoring because the court has eyes." Harlan's brows went up. "You can compel that?" "I can say it loud enough that men who want to be thought decent will act as if compelled," Judge Caldwell said. "If you don't, I'll write your name into the order in a way that reads poorly, and Mrs. Delaney will tell your customers." "I will," May said. The crowd dispersed in the way crowds do when their scare has been given a chore to carry. Jonas sat on the bank, hands hanging, head tilted back as if asking the sky to promise a cooler hour. Iloan lowered herself beside him and found that her bones had been replaced by kiln-dried versions of themselves, lighter, harder, more brittle if not treated carefully. "You held," he said. "So did you," she said. "We're what the ditch is built of." He turned his head and looked at her, and there was that rearranging in her ribs again. A feeling like a house whose windows have been opened for the first time in a long time, and found the hinges still able to sing. They might have kissed. In a different story. In this one she wiped mud off her chin with the back of her hand and grinned while her ankle complained like an old aunt, and thought, later. Later. If the judge writes his order before Harlan writes another fire. Later did not get its turn that afternoon. They were halfway to the house. The apricot stuttering in a breeze that had decided to be kind again when the boy who had carried the first bad news of the day came tearing up the lane with fresh. He slid off his pony so fast he left one stirrup swinging. "Clerk Sutter," he panted, eyes big. "Clerk Sutter says he says the contract, he says Miss Rusk signed a release this morning at the courthouse while you all were at the ditch. He's got the paper with her name on it and a witness writ. The world did that double image thing it does when a person has run too fast and stops too sudden. Iloan saw 2 shed roofs, 2 apricots. She made them one by force of will. "That's a lie," Jonas said, heat in his voice that belonged to a furnace he saved for very few occasions. It's a forgery, May said, already winding her apron tight enough to strangle something later with it if she had to. He's too tidy to have the nerve for it, but he's tidy enough to sign for another man if asked. Who's the witness? Elowin asked, though part of her didn't want the answer, because names put on lies are harder to wash off than. Hans, the boy swallowed. Mr. Voss, he said. And he glanced toward the Voss range and lowered his voice, as if sound could climb fences. And Scarlyle. Scarjaw had a name then, Lyle. It made him human in a way Elowin would have preferred to avoid. Back to town, Jonas said. He had already started moving. They reached the store-turned courtroom panting. Sutter stood behind the bolt table with a paper held like a shield. Harlan stood beside him with his benevolent donor face on and his hand on the book's spine, as if the book were kin. Scarjaw Lyle skulked near the door, hat in his hands, eyes too bright. Judge Caldwell took the paper and read. His face did a careful thing that was not outrage and not acceptance. It was a magistrate's way of buying himself 2 more breaths to work with. Miss Rusk, he said, this appears to be your name. Elowin stepped to the table and looked. The letters were hers. Not the shape, which only an intimate would recognize, but the discipline. She made her loops narrow to save ink and her stems tall, because she liked order. Whoever had written this had practiced her hand as if wanting to be her badly in a way that felt like a second offense. That's not mine, she said. Her voice surprised her by being calm and cool instead of the spiked thing it wanted to be. What does it say I've released? Water from the East Branch and any claim upon Mr. Voss for correspondence fees and rail fare, the judge read. And consent that the prior contract be closed without prejudice. He looked up. This is sound for him, if sound at all. Harlan parted his hands as if humbly accepting a blessing he's already counted. The lady rethought. One cannot blame her. Farms ask more courage than letters do. Elowin looked at Scarlyle and spoke to him because some decisions stick better when a man has to answer to the person he's hurting instead of to a room. You witnessed this? His jaw tightened. I saw a hand move a pen. Did you see? It was mine? He didn't answer. Which was its own answer. Judge Caldwell frowned. Sutter? Clerk Sutter made his mouth a moral line and tried to hang his weight on it. Miss Rusk stepped into my office mid-morning and stated she'd seen the wisdom in avoiding litigation. She signed. Mr. Voss stood as surety. Mr. Lyle observed. I was at the ditch, Elowin said, under the judge's own eye. So you were, the judge said thoughtfully, and the room bent toward him as plants bend toward windows. Harlan's smile didn't change. His eyes did, the way a cat's eyes change when it hears one note it did not expect in a song it thought it knew. Perhaps the lady visited earlier, he suggested, before you joined us. Or sent a note with a sensible friend. I don't send my name with friends, Elowin said. I carry it myself. The judge turned the paper and held it to the window. Ink shows its truths when the sun looks through it. The thin pressed pulp told the story of where the pen had hesitated and where it had flowed. He set it down. We will inquire, he said. We'll compare to earlier signatures. The door banged. The boy who had been the afternoon's messenger stood there again, with a face like a month-old thunderhead. North Head. He yelled, more hoarse this time. The gate something's wrong water's cutting hard at the road, Barons. Boys tried to turn it and got swept one of 'em's in. He swallowed. In it. Everything in the room turned and reached in the same direction. Jonas was already moving. May Delaney snatched a coil of rope from behind the counter and flung it at Elowin without asking if she could throw. The judge grabbed his hat and forgot his dignity and remembered it again enough to snatch his docket so the law would have eyes at the scene. Harlan hesitated a single, damning second long enough to calculate which story would suit him and then swept through the door with his hat brim low. Elowin moved. Her ankle screamed and she let it. Outside, the air had changed. The sound from the north was wrong, too fast, too solid, the kind of sound that makes a body think of hooves when no horses are in sight. They ran toward it, the whole town like a string being drawn from one end of a bow. The gate had not only jumped, it had twisted. The pin that should have been a small soldier in a war against chaos had been sheared smooth by a force more clever than water alone. The box canted. The main run gorged and through. The ditch went blind with silt. In the boil below, Boy's hat circled once and was gone. A hand briefly clawed at the lip and slipped. "Rope," Jonas said, and Ilawan was already tying one end around the post at the head and the other around her waist. May made a sound Ilawan had never heard from her before, a cracked, small thing. "No." "I know that water," Ilawan said, and did not explain that she knew it, because she had fallen before and learned what you learn falling, when to go with the pull and when to become a rock. "Let me," Jonas said. "I'm stronger." "You're needed at the bar," she said, meaning the iron, meaning the gate. "I'm the one with the knee loop in my head." He understood. He didn't like it. He nodded anyway and shoved the iron into the track with a savage economy that made the metal complain. Ilawan took 3 quick breaths to teach her blood that this was happening, and then slid down the bank on her left hip. The water hit her like a man hitting a door with both shoulders. Cold, furious, convinced of its own intentions. The rope grabbed at her waist and made a promise and a threat at once. She planted her cane into the bed and found no bed there, only royal. She went to hands instead and felt for a human thing among the wet heavies that were only mud and weed and bad luck. There a sleeve, no, a stick. There the stick turned and there was an elbow inside it. She grabbed. The current tore. She tore. Back harder. The world narrowed to 2 hands, one above water and one below, and a rope that wanted to be a snake. "Hold her." Someone shouted behind her. "Hold her or you'll lose both." Ilawan's ankle howled as the current found it and bent it the old way, and then a new worse way. She bent her whole self over the rope and the arm she held and made herself a hinge and a hook and a home. The boy's face broke the surface nose first, eyes wide, mouth open for a sound he had to spend on air. "You're all right," she said to him, which was a lie and also a truth because he was, in the moment he was, and she intended to stack those moments until a minute became a life. The rope jerked. Jonas had a grip and 3 more had joined. Him and they were hauling on a rhythm no drummer could keep up with. Ilawan kicked with her left leg and used her right like a rudder in a boat that wanted very much to capsize. Her hands turned to claws. The boy's fingers clawed back. For a second their grips slid and she saw years of herself vanish into the place where almost lives. She bared her teeth at the water. "Pull!" Jonas shouted. The iron bar shrieked. The gate moved a hair. The current shifted, and in that flick of a world decided to argue elsewhere. They came up the bank in a tangle of limbs and water and rope and curses. The boy coughed a staccato worth a symphony. Ilawan's hands would have liked to shake. She told them later. She rolled to her side and laughed once, loud and short, because some part of her could not quite believe air had happened again. "Fool," May whispered, kneeling beside her and touching her wet hair as if checking for thorns. "Good fool." Ilawan propped herself, pushed hair from her eyes, and looked toward the head. Jonas was on the bar, with Sutter bracing the slide with a board, as if trying to teach it a new habit by example. The judge stood ankle-deep with his trousers dark and ruinous. Harlan was gone. No, not gone. On the bank above, a horse shouldered through willows. Harlan sat it. He watched for one heartbeat too long and then turned his mount toward the road. A man who had expected muddy valor for the price of a paper had found the price, higher than he'd planned to pay. Ilawan's gaze snapped to Scarlisle. He had stayed and pulled, and his hurt lip had gone gray. He met her eyes once and then dropped them like something heavy. The gate settled by inches. The run's shout softened to a complaint. People stepped away from the edge and remembered to shiver, because shivering is the body's ledger making. An entry. Paid out, paid out. Enough, the judge said. We're done in here until I write orders with language that doesn't leak. If any man touches this head without the town's eyes on him, I'll find rope for more than Banks. He meant it 2 ways and didn't care who heard which. They trailed back to town dripping. Eloan's ankle had turned from white pain to a dense, persuasive throb that had opinions. Jonas put his arm under hers, once when the ground tilted, without asking permission. She let him because they were past asking. In the store, the paper, with her forged name, still sat where the judge had left it. It looked small in the wreckage of a day that had tried to be a river. The judge set his wet hat brim down on the bolt table and reached for the paper, but his hand stopped halfway. Miss Rusk, he said softly, if I tell you the law can set this right, I'll be telling you only a polite portion of the truth. The law can set some of it right. The rest of it you've been setting yourselves all day. Eloan nodded once. Then let's do both. He opened his mouth to answer, and the door blew inward as if anger had learned carpentry. Jonas reacted faster than thought and turned his body into a shield without checking what he was shielding against. Eloan's cane came up because habit is faster than fear. Harlan. Voss filled the doorway. Behind him, 2 men she didn't know, 1 she did, and a third with a badge pinned to a vest that had seen less honest weather than any shirt in the room. The badged man unfolded a paper with the solemn relish of a boy about to say a memorized part in a play he believes proves him grown. Jonas Alder, he intoned, by authority of the county, you are under arrest for malicious manipulation of a public waterwork resulting in danger to property and life. Complaint sworn by Harlan Voss. Clerk countersigned. Bail set at. He glanced at Sutter, who supplied a number large enough to make May Delaney swear under her breath. Effective now. Harlan's face wore triumph the way some men wear cologne, heavy and meant to be noticed. He looked past Jonas and found Eloan's eyes. Some contracts end themselves, he said conversationally. Some require help. Jonas lifted his wrists before anyone could ask and did not argue because arguing would have spent what he needed to save. He only turned his head, found Eloan, and said in a voice hoarse from smoke and river, keep the gate, and in it was a wedding vow that had nothing to do with paper. They took him. The judge barked a protest, formal and urgent, and got a shrug from the badge because badges like to shrug when they know a richer hand is on their back. May took 1 step forward with her ledger like a club, and Eloan put her hand out without looking and touched May's sleeve, and May stopped because she trusted the woman, who had tied herself to a river, more than she trusted any rage. Eloan stood straight, though the room tilting had finally tilted her ankle past courtesy. She put both palms on the bolt table where Harlan had laid her forged release, as if to brace the whole town with her hands. The apricot leaf she had touched that morning clung to the inside of her mind, the way a small green thing will in a bad drought. Mr. Voss, she said, and her voice did not rise because it did not need to. If you think paper and chains will do what fire and water couldn't, you've mistaken what you're fighting. He tilted his head, amused the way a boy is who has not yet learned some toys break the player. And what am I fighting, Miss Rusk? She held his gaze and did not blink. A woman who learned to stand up in a moving river, she said, and a town that just watched her do it. A hum went through the room, not applause, not yet, but something like a far train gathering, inevitable coming. Harlan's smile slipped and recovered. He tapped the forged paper with a knuckle like a man tapping a bar to call for another round. We'll see, he said lightly. In court. In court, Judge Caldwell repeated, but there was iron in his voice now. He reached for the forged release and then stopped because his gaze had snagged on the signature again, and something in it had finally declared itself. Miss Rusk, he said slowly, eyes on the pitch of the R, the lift of the K, the pen stop. At the end of the W, when you write your name, do you ever? He looked up, surprised by his own thought. Do you ever dot the I in Rusk? Ilawan blinked. There is no I in Rusk, she said. Exactly, Judge Caldwell whispered, and snatched up the page and turned with it toward the window where the light was better and the whole room leaned. After him, the revelation raced across his face like sunrise on a wall. He spun back. Mouth opening and outside, from the direction of the north head, a new sound rose. A sound the ditch only makes once in a generation when something gives that should not give at all. The ground under their feet thumped. A jar slipped from a shelf and cracked. The bell on May's door chimed itself without being touched. Gate, Jonas had said. Ilawan felt the word land in her like a thrown rope. She grabbed her cane. She moved for the door, and as she crossed the threshold, the world ahead of her began to roar. Roar. It carried through the summer air like a torn sheet, a sound too big to belong to any one thing, and therefore belonging to everything at once. The headworks, the road, the ditch, the way a town swallows, and then holds its breath when it hears trouble speaking its own name. Ilawan didn't slow to let the ache negotiate. The ache could sign its protests in triplicate later. Right now it could ride in the wagon of her body and keep quiet. She caught the doorframe with one palm, found the step without looking, and moved into the street at a pace that made her cane a metronome for urgency. The town poured around her, all of them turning north the way iron filings turn toward a magnet when the magnet decides to stop pretending to be a rock. Gate, she said, not to anyone and to everyone, because Jonas had said it before the chin. Doors slammed on him, and the badge and the law that was sometimes a law and sometimes a costume. Judge Caldwell's eyes were on the paper with her name that wasn't her name, but the sound unhooked his gaze and hung it on the same north the rest of them were using. Go, he said, and then gave himself the order to go. He thrust the forged release into May's hands like a woman is a better desk than a barrel and ran. They took the lane that followed the ditch because a person who wants to fix a thing walks beside it long enough to learn where it likes to fail. The ditch told its own story as they went dark streaks down a bank where a seep had learned courage. A fresh crumble where last night's bucket line had scuffed clay to weak. Ilawan kept her eye on the places where men stand to work and where men stand to watch men work, because men who break things prefer the second place dot. At the head the shape of the disaster snapped into focus. The slide had twisted farther. Not jumped this time, wrenched. The iron pin that held it true had sheared clean as if a giant had taken wire cutters to it. Water had found the gap, widened it with the patient lunacy of anything determined, and now shouldered into the road cut beyond the head box where the clay had always fancied itself stronger than it was. A bar of white water frothed where the ditch lost its identity and decided to audition for river. Sand. May threw the word like a bag itself. Boys will always run toward a task that makes their legs feel like news. Boards. Ilawan said, already sliding down the bank on her left hip, the canvas of her skirt taking mud like a signature. Bar. Iron. The judge skidded to a halt behind her, bent double, hands on his knees, and looked up with a face that had become a field-faceless courthouse, more fence-fixing. Miss Rusk, hold the top, she said, shoving the first board into the slit the water had invented. Keep the board from skating. He did. His hands were soft from papers, and still he did. Sutter had arrived with a reluctance that wore a hat. He hovered at the edge of useful like a man hoping to be mistaken for furniture. Ilawan didn't spare him a look. She felt the pull in the board and matched it with a push from the heel of her hand, the way the body learns to meet pressure with pressure when a joint has opinions every day of its life. Bar, she said again, and Selgrady jammed the iron into the track and put her weight on it, the way a woman leans into a plow when there's nobody else to lean with her. The metal screamed. then grudged them a finger's worth of progress. The water hissed in a new key that meant they were winning 1 inch and losing 3 unless they changed the math. Upstream, Ilawan called. Throw bags above, not below. Slow it before it gets here, the boys adjusted. The judge swore in the voice of a man who remembers he learned fine language in his youth and chooses course now because course moves faster. Sutter took a step down the bank and then back up it when the water spat at his boots. "Where's Voss?" Sel asked, not because they needed him and not because they wanted him, but because a disaster has a habit of writing a roll call and writing it hard. Harlan was not there. The blank space where a rich man should have stood made a hollow sound no water could fill. Scarlyle stood 2 paces off with his hat in his hands and his eyes trying on decency as if it were a borrowed coat. Ilawan didn't look at him, because looking at men like that, when they are deciding makes their decision try to please your eyes instead of their conscience. She wanted his conscience if it had any meat left on it. The board took the brunt of the new shove and bowed. The iron pin at the top of the slide snapped like a tooth. The gate groaned. The water surged with the logic of math that has decided to be a bully. Ilawan felt something very old and very particular rise inside her. Not fear, she had paid the price of fear the first time she'd fallen and learned she would rise again slower than other people and still rise. Not rage, though there was a red edge to it. It was the small hard grain a person keeps for when they are done being asked to explain that they are here on purpose. "Sel," she said. "Knee." Sel Grady braced. Ilawan leaned her weight into the board, bad foot back, cane set deep, left hip down. The water climbed her skirt, turned it into a flag that didn't know which way to blow, and she let it. The problem wasn't the wet, the problem was the leverage. She gave it the shape it wanted and then punished it for wanting. "Rope," May said from above, already throwing. The coil fell straight as a good intention. It landed on Ilawan's shoulder, and she ducked it around the board and tied with the speed of a woman who has had to tie faster than other people walk. "On 3, the judge said, because judges like 3s. 1, 2, they didn't wait for 3. They hauled as a town. The slide squealed back into its mortises. The sudden reduction in flow thumped the board like a chest deciding to breathe, and then everything that wasn't the board breathed. 2. Someone cheered. It might have been Ilawan. It might have been the ditch. They held until the shock went out of the gate and the water took its original lesson like a scolded dog. Sacks stacked. Boards were traded for earth. The road's fresh bite stopped widening and sulked instead. The roar climbed down 2 rungs of the ladder and found itself a manageable shout. Ilawan took the board's weight off her hands, then her shoulder, then her bones. She felt the world sway, and then steady, she stood. She did it because standing after is a way of telling the town that before did not own you. Judge Caldwell stripped his coat with the gesture of a man taking off someone else's mistake and rolled his sleeves, forearms pale and furred and suddenly not funny at all. He looked toward Sutter, who had not moved except to move back. "Bring me the forged paper," the judge said, mild as a man ordering eggs. "And the schedule with your tidy handwriting you mislaid in the name of appetite." Sutter's mouth opened and shut. He had the look of a man realizing the room he thought was full of chairs had been tables all along, and he'd been climbing the wrong things. Now," the judge said, and there was enough iron in it to make a horseshoe. Scarlyle startled like a horse at a sudden bell. He took 2 steps forward, as if his boots had borrowed courage from the judge's voice. "I saw it," he blurted. "Not the signing, no, the practice." Sutter practiced her hand. He had a note she'd wrote the clerk the first day, asked after the judge's return. He copied it. He used the same scratch nib, too. He keeps a box of them in the 3rd drawer. The one sticks. He said Mr. Voss needed it right particular for the sake of calm. The judge turned his head slowly. "Mr. Lyle," he said, "did you swear the paper because a man told you to, or because your eyes and conscience agreed?" Lil's jaw worked. He swallowed. "Because I ain't got a head for reading like others," he said, plain and dirty with shame. "I can tell a brand in moonlight and a calf's cough in wind, but I can't tell a letter from its cousin." Sutter said I saw what he meant, and I thought maybe I had. Then I saw Miss Rusk with the rope on and the boy coming up out of the water, and I figured what I'd seen wasn't what I'd seen. Elowen turned to him and put her voice where his shame could hear it. "You can fix seeing wrong," she said. "Standing wrong ruins you." Lyle nodded once like a man taking a shot without making a fuss. Sutter sagged. "There's a point where a certain kind of man remembers he is not his tidy handwriting." He reached into his vest slowly and brought out the folded release with a care that made his fingertips look like they were touching a bruise. "Mr. Voss told me," he started. "Save that for the record," the judge said. "You'll have more chance to talk than you'll enjoy." He took the paper and held it to the sun again the way he had in May's store. The light builded its case. He tapped the dot over the non-existent I in Rusk with one finger, and then the drag where a man not used to her name had to think too long about where the K curls. "Fraud," he said soft, "and not an artful one." "Where is Jonas?" Elowen asked, because that was the only question her ribs would make room for now that the ditch had stopped shouting. "Cell," said the badge, appearing finally as if summoned by guilt. He looked damp in a way that wasn't sweat. "Bail's set and not a number any of us carry around loose." "Set by whom?" Judge Caldwell asked without taking his eyes off Sutter. "By me," Sutter said, too fast for it to be anything but fear. "The statute allows. The statute of paper," the judge said. And now the genial was gone and the gavel lived in his mouth. "I've seen your statute. I've seen your hours. I've seen your pin cut like a piece of cheese, Mr. Voss." He shouted, and men near the road started as if a storm had cracked. "If you've got words, bring them where the town can hear them. If you've got shame, keep your distance. And send a lawyer who doesn't smell of fuse." Harlan answered by not answering. The blank of him remained a shape on the far bank under the cottonwoods and then ghosted. Away. May Delaney set her fists on her hips in a way that meant she had made a decision, and it would be the town's decision if the town wanted bread tomorrow. "We done?" she asked Elowen, meaning at the head. "For now," Elowen said. "Then we go to the jail," May said. "I'll bring the bell." They marched. The water followed its corrected path like a chastened dog, and the road kept most of its shape, and the cottonwoods published what they'd seen in leaves. The jail squatted beside the courthouse like a box that had married a box. The badge fumbled his keys only once, which was more mercy than some men get. Jonas stood when he heard them come. He looked as if he'd been battered, though they'd laid no hand on him, battered by the new kind of waiting a man does when he's told he can't step in where he's needed most. He met Elowen's eyes through the bars, and all the noise in the room forgot itself for a beat. "You kept the gate," he said. "We kept it," she corrected. "Because the pronoun matters when you're building a life. Judge Caldwell signed something. On something, the law dresses its corrections in paper, even when the wrong it's correcting was a knife." "Mr. Alder," he said, "you are released on your own recognizance because I recognize you. You will present yourself tomorrow morning for a hearing that will turn into a trial if it must, but I doubt it will must. Clerk Sutter, you will accompany me to a table where we will take a statement that will have the smell of honesty if I have to wash each word myself." Sutter looked very much like a wet word. He nodded. Lyle shifted his weight and then planted as if deciding to be a post honest men could tie a horse to. They opened the cell. Jonas stepped into a room that felt too small for how wide Elowen's relief had grown. He reached for her, but didn't touch. She reached for him and did. Her palm found the place on his shoulder where the rope had burned itself into the skin when he'd hauled at the gate the first time that day. She pressed her hand there as if she could tell the rope to leave some of its strength behind when it quit aching. They might have taken a moment. The town didn't let them. Towns never do. Calamity and process prefer an audience. Mercy is the only quiet worker, and it had already earned its supper today. Judge, May said briskly, you'll hold your hearing in my store again. The courthouse is too close to Sutter's habits. Agreed, the judge said. 2 hours. Make it 1, Elowen said. Harlan won't stay away from the head by invitation. He'll go where a hand can do what it did to that pin. She looked at Jonas. We hinge our doors, we check the apricot, we drink water, then we put our names down firm. They did those things in that order. The hinge on the back door had loosened in the smoke. Jonas snugged the screws with the patience of a man who had spent a long winter teaching a stubborn hand to hold a screwdriver. The apricot wore a new green, as if it had been saving it for after. Elowen lifted a leaf to her cheek and let its cool remind her that soft is not the absence of strong. At May's, the hearing was simpler than Elowen had expected and more complicated than her tired wanted. Sutter spoke. He told on himself the way a man will when the room had already begun to think less of him. He said Harlan had called the forgery public peace. He said he had thought it a kindness to spare a woman the long trouble of a fight she would likely lose. He tried to fold fear into his story like egg whites and make it look like inevitability. The judge did not let it hold. Scarlyle spoke. He didn't lift his eyes off the floorboards while he did. He named the room where he'd watched Sutter practice, named the box with the scratched nibs and the drawer that stuck. He named Dr. Pembry ashamed and Ken Barron's boys brave. When the judge asked him why he'd waited, he said, simply, because I am slower than I know I should be. Elowen spoke last. She did not talk about her ankle. She talked about the ditch, about hours hung on a schedule like laundry hung on a day with no wind, about the spigot and the way a town drinks in order. To listen, about the sliding gate and the sound water makes when it learns the wrong habit. She held the forged release and did not tear it, because tearing can be dramatic and drama wears out faster than truth. I did not sign my name to quit, she said. I signed to declare. She lowered the paper, her hand steady. I declare. Water enough for all when the town behaves like a town. The judge wrote. When he spoke, the words had the shape of a fence line finally agreed upon at dusk. Findings, he said. The court finds the alleged release a fraud on its face and in its dot. The court finds the allocation a theft with ink. The court orders the headworks under joint supervision until a proper board is convened. The court delays any marriage license not because the lady cannot, but because the clerk has shown he will not, and the paper must be clean before I let any couple set their hands to it. He looked at Elowen then square, unblinking. If you want the license, you'll have it. If you want the weight, I'll give you a bench while I fix this desk of a county. Jonas's breath came out like someone setting a bucket down. He didn't answer for both of them. He never did. She loved him for that without saying the word yet. She would say it when she could say it like a stake and not like a curtain. Harlan didn't come. That was a thing in itself. He's at the head. Elowen said quietly into the hum that follows a town being told it may keep drinking from its cup. He'll be where a pin lies and a pry bar can be hid under a coat. Then we go where the work is, the judge said, and there was more fondness than he meant to let out in his voice, as if he had come to like the kind of trial you can do with your hands better than the kind you do with your Latin dot. They were almost to the cottonwoods when the second roar of the day found them. Not the shred of sheet this time. The deep belly sound of a thing deciding to fail all at once. The head box didn't break. The ground under the road did not tell a creek that a road is more important than it, and the creek will nod for a while, and then, one day, shrug. The road at the bend, where Barron's boys had cut a relief trench earlier, had always believed itself the more permanent of the two. It discovered otherwise in front of God and everyone. The shoulders slumped. The topsoil slid. The path the boys had cut turned from suggestion to invitation, and a chunk of the road, small at first, then larger, tore itself free and went down in a wet, sucked gasp, like a man realizing at last that his lungs prefer air. 2 wagons coming from the east jolted, wheels slewing. One driver hauled his team up hard. The other too fast, too proud of his speed, found his rig's weight arguing with gravity and lost. Eloan's body moved before her brain fetched all the letters for what she was seeing. She went to the edge because the edge is where you go if you are the person who has practiced falling and standing more than most. The wagon tilted, one wheel hanging. A girl no more than 12 clung to the seat rail with both hands and a terror too big for her face. Behind her, flour sacks slid, then held, then slid again. The driver sawed and swore and prayed in the same breath, and none of it was going to be enough. "Rope!" Eloan shouted again. The town had ropes where it did not have patience. May threw. Jonas caught. The judge did not miss. Sutter, sweating redemption, took a turn around a cottonwood as if tying a tie he wanted to be remembered for once in his life. Eloan tied herself first, then the throw to the wagon's rear axle. "Lean when I say," she called to the girl. The girl nodded so fast it meant she wasn't hearing anything but the idea of a yes. "Not yet," Eloan said. "Not yet." She watched the way the earth slumped, the way the sacks thumped, the way the wheel chewed at dirt that had given up being dirt and become pudding. She waited for the swing every falling thing makes, that little hesitation at the top of the arc. That is the only place a slow body has a right to pretend it is. "Fast, now!" They leaned together, Eloan back on the rope, Jonas back farther, Sel back so far her braid brushed the dirt. The judge made his body a post he had no right to be good at, and managed it anyway. Lyle took the free tail and wrapped it around his guts like a bandage against an old loss. The wheel found purchase. The wagon grunted. The girl made a sound the size of a baby's first breath. The team stepped as if the ground had been waiting for their hooves all morning, and the wagon cleared the edge and rolled into safety as if it had never thought of the other choice. People cheered and then pretended not to have. The driver jumped down and then had to sit because his legs had decided to be new. The girl climbed off the seat and stood on earth for a second, as if the earth were a novelty, and then turned and looked straight at Eloan the way children do when they are choosing what kind of adult to become. "Thank you," she said, solemn. "As the law, you limped and still you ran faster than the men." Eloan blinked hard enough to clear the river out of her eyes and put a hand on the girl's shoulder. "I learned to run with different parts," she said. "You'll learn, too." If the day had been decent, it would have given them a stretch of quiet to learn their new breaths. It did not. A shout from the head turned all of them again. Harlan Voss stood with one foot on the head box and the other on the bank like a man trying to ride 2 horses with one saddle. In his hand, a thin steel tool with a bite at the end, a pick meant for nails and pins. His coat gaped open. In the lining a pocket sagged where a length of oil-black rope had lived before learning to live other places. "Mr. Voss," the judge called, no coat, sleeves wet, dignity strangely more permanent than the road had been. "Step down." Harlan's smile returned, larger now, careless with something ugly under it. "Just checking my investment, Judge," he said. "This head means beef on hoof and coin in hand. I've a right to examine how the town's fools have hammered it." Lyle had the misfortune to be closest. He moved without meaning to, some old habit of pleasing the biggest hat tugging his body like a string from the back. Harlan used Lyle's motion the way a factory uses steam heat, pressure, motion. He feinted toward the slide, then went for the chock, pick biting. The pin-poor dear, faithful thing shivered. Eloan didn't shout. Shouting spends air. She went. The world narrowed to the span between her boot and Harlan's hand. Her ankle. Screamed at the idea and then made a bargain with her. She would pay later. Now would be now. She hit him at the hip the way a woman hits a door that doesn't want to be a door anymore. He staggered. The pick skittered. The pin lived another breath. Harlan turned, caught her shoulder in his hand, and for a second the world felt like the depot again, like a man creating a no and expecting her to curl under it, till she fit. He squeezed. She let him. She let him so she could place her cane exactly where she needed it, behind the knee that carried less work than the other because it had never been asked to carry much more than a saddle. She hooked and shoved. His leg buckled not because she was stronger, but because she had learned which moments are the weak ones. Harlan fell against the headbox, arms flailing, and for a second his mouth made a boy's shape astonishment at the physics of his own body. His heel slithered. His boot went over the edge into the spill. He grabbed for anything and found Eloan's sleeve. He took her with him. The water wasn't the long rush of the ditch proper. It was the violent foamed insistence of a spill where a headbox was being asked to behave like a waterfall. It took them both in the same slap. Eloan's breath left and then returned as a number of small ragged pieces scrambling for a name. Harlan yanked at her to climb himself. She let her body go soft where he wanted a rung and hard where the water wanted a rag. She turned into a thing the current could not obligingly use for ladder and could not easily wash away either. Rope. Someone shouted and rope came. It came like grace comes through human hands. Take it, Harlan gasped, fingers like claws on her sleeve. Pick gone, hat gone. The look on his face, the look of a man finally meeting a judge he cannot lean on. Eloan put the loop into his hands because she was not going to be the kind of law he had tried to write in ink. Hold, she said. He held, of course he did. Men who love life can be relied on for that at least. Lyle was there, cursing in a voice that broke on the edges, hauling like a man trying to pull his own history up and get it breathing. Jonas grabbed the line with bad fingers and good intention, and May wrapped the tail around the cottonwood that had already learned to be a post that day. They brought Harlan up panting, ugly, alive. He rolled to the grass and made the sound of a boy caught halfway between sobbing and claiming he'd meant to do the dangerous thing. Eloan remained where the water wanted the next thing, because the water had a long list and she had just taken a man's place on it. The rope swung back. She caught it by feel because her eyes were full of ditch. Her ankle did something electric and then something numb. Her arms were new animals. She let the line teach them their job, and she taught the line hers, and then she was on grass and gravity pretended to love her again. She rolled to her back and saw the sky in pieces between leaves. Some of the pieces were the color of the apricot leaf, if the apricot leaf could forgive the world for being hot and hard. She laughed once because breathing demanded it. Judge Caldwell leaned over her, and in his face she saw a man who had found out late that what he liked best about the law was the parts that washed his sleeves. Miss Rusk, he said, and what lived in his voice was not a title. If you would like to marry this man, his chin tipped toward Jonas, who had the rope burn of a wedding ring on both hands now, I will make Sutter write your names. As straight as a fence line at dawn, as soon as I am done making a different man write his name, where names go when they've spoiled something. Eloan closed her eyes for one count, not because she needed to rest them, but because she wanted the yes that formed in her throat to be the size it deserved. Yes, she said, but not because a near drowning makes it romantic. Because he matched my stride and learned my loop. She opened her eyes, found Jonas's face, which looked suddenly young in the way a man's face looks young when it has finally put down a weight it held too long. And because he said, "You," all I need when it was not convenient to mean it. Jonas laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. Today proved I was wrong, he said hoarsely. You're more than I need. The town permitted itself a smile. It permitted itself two. Then it remembered the other man on the grass, Harlan. Sat up with the injured dignity of someone who has never had to sit in dirt that wasn't his own. He coughed river and glared and tried to find a hat he'd lost. The pick lay 3 feet away like evidence and apology. Double quotes, Mr. Voss. Judge Caldwell said, still sleeves rolled, still no coat, the most judge he had been all day. You are under arrest for destruction of a public work, conspiracy to defraud, and being a bore. The last wasn't a charge in any book, but the town needed to hear it said aloud. Harlan opened his mouth to shape a threat. Lael surprised his own boots by stepping between Harlan and the judge. No, he said, just that. 1 syllable with a spine in it, the badge ashamed. But Learning put his hand on Harlan's shoulder and then his hands around Harlan's wrists. Sutter took the pick with 2 fingertips and held it away from his body as if it were the idea of himself he had. Decided to stop liking. The light had changed while they worked. The day leaned toward evening. The cottonwoods made coins of what sun was left. The ditch ran with the new sound that water makes when a town has finally given it a good reason to behave. They walked back together, quieter. At the yard the apricot stood in its square of damp blessedness and did the brave work small green things do. Converted the loud of the day into sugar. And something to grow on. They married at the pump in May Delaney's store because the store held more vows than the courthouse had law and because the bell could count the words correctly. Sutter wrote the names. He wrote them very carefully. He did not dot any letter that did not deserve it. Jonas Alder, the judge said. Ilawan. Rusk. He did not ask if anyone objected. If anyone had, the town would have leapt on the objector and carried him out like a sack of split flour. They signed. Jonas with the hand that had learned slow. Ilawan with the hand that had learned fast to make up for a foot that would never. The pen scratched the same way rope had today honest noise for honest work. There were cakes. Sal had no right to have found time to bake and had done it anyway. There was coffee because coffee is what you drink when water has already shone. You who is boss, and you want to stay awake for the rest of your life. There were toasts that pretended to be about luck and were quietly about labor. Judge Caldwell announced the interim water board and named 3 women and 2 men, and the town did not argue. He set the hours and the relief trenches and the fines and wrote Harlan's name where it would best itch him. He scheduled Sutter's arraignment, and because the county had not given him enough staff for the job, told May he would borrow her bell if he needed to make more law with noise. Night came in clean. The windmill ticked. The mule bit Jonas's sleeve and then Ilawan's. And then, unusually, nobody's. The road held through. The repairs men with sense had started while the vows were being said. Barron's boys fell asleep in chairs and were left there because waking the hero is a kind of theft. Ilawan and Jonas sat on the stoop and watched stars arrive, the way a person watches family coming down the lane after too long. Counting, making room. She set her cane across her knees not because she needed it at the moment, but because it had earned the right to be where the names were. You saved him, Jonas said at last, the soft wonder of the day's one mystery finally finding his mouth. You could have let him go, and we would have called it fair. Ilawan pressed her knuckles to the boards until the boards and her skin agreed on whose imprint would last. I am not interested in a life where fair tastes like ash, she said. Besides, if he had died in our spill, the water would have been his. I won't give him that. Jonas made a small approving sound. He reached for her hand and she let him have it. The apricot's leaves clicked once, a sound like a green-throated yes. Down the road, a rider paused under the cottonwoods, where the head had nearly become a story about graves. The rider did not come closer. He lifted a hand and held up something pale that caught the lantern a moment. It might have been a letter. He tied it to the cottonwood and rode off without revealing the shape of his face. Ilawan saw the motion, because she had trained herself to see motion at the edges where other people miss it. Jonas, she said, rising with the careful economy of someone who had promised her ankle she would be gentle and meant it. At the trees. They walked together, slow, the way people who have learned to stand in rivers choose to walk on dry land. The note on the trunk was slim and folded twice, the county's official paper. Apprentice to the paper that had nearly undone them, Jonas broke the wax with his lips and handed it to her because she had been the day's best reader. She opened it, and the words in tidy hand did not belong to Sutter. They belonged to someone who had learned a cleaner script, someone who'd spent evenings practicing with a pen instead of a pry bar. Elo and Rusk. It read, the capital E unnecessarily ornate the way courtiers write when they are trying to remind. You who is king, you think you've won a ditch. The railroad thinks otherwise. Surveyors write at dawn to mark a new line. Water is a right until a larger right claims it. Pack your sapling. Pack your pride. There was no signature. The paper smelled faintly of oil. A wind ran down the ditch like a rumor would run if it had legs and breath. The cottonwoods answered in coin talk. The apricot leaf nearest the gate turned over to show its pale underside, as if the tree wanted to read with them and could not learn late the way humans can. Elowin looked toward the east, where the road would write morning into the town, and felt her throat make a shape around. Something that was not fear and not laughter and not sorrow, but borrowed iron. Tomorrow, she said, voice steady as a gate hammered true. We'll learn a larger loop. A coyote sang once in the wash and then was quiet as if he too had decided to listen for hoofbeats. The night held its breath, and somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, where the creek bent like a question mark, a lantern winked and began to move.